we're reading White Fang, and we are likely going to finish White Fang as there are but 3 chapters remaining in the novel. I was talking to Valana today about how there is a movie and how it compares to the book, and it's just radically different. The subject matter is vaguely related in that there is a wolf dog in each of them, probably with white fangs, and beyond that, it kind of departs insanely. So I have no idea what these last 3 chapters are going to include, but it does not look good for our puppers. Incidentally, when we finish this, I do have Carmilla prepared, so we'll continue with Carmilla after taking a short break when we finish White Fang, assuming that these chapters aren't insanely long and we actually end up just finishing. But probably not. We're probably going to get started into Carmilla, which brings up for me and another conundrum is the last time I did 2 books in one stream, the video editing was a nightmare. The markers, they don't carry over the way you think they would carry over in DaVinci Resolve, and anyways, I'll probably just make a copy of the damn video file. That said, yeah, the last time we were reading White Fang, what do I remember? There was a famine, right? First I think the village moved on, and he tried to depart from the village. He hid. He hid away into in the forest, and when Grey Beaver and his family came looking for him, he just kind of hunkered down and resisted the urge to return to the man animals. When the village moved on and the sun set, he realized how unprepared he was for this. He no longer knew how to survive in the wild. He was lonely, and that pained him. So he went running for 3 days solid, and coincidentally came across Grey Beaver, who fed him some food and took him back in, and that was resolved. That was an interesting thing. Another event that occurred afterwards was there was a famine, and it turned out that the man-animal gods would eat the dogs sometimes, and so White Fang's nope. We're noping out of this, and all of a sudden he was perfectly capable of surviving in the wild again. That's, I suppose, what we would call an inconsistency, a plot loop, a plot hole, if you will. He was out and about, surviving barely, and when Yip Yip, is it Yip Yip or Lip Lip? It might have been Lip Lip, actually, I forget. Either way, he was the antagonist in White Fang's introduction to the tribe, and would cause him a lot of trouble. Well, he met him out in the wild, and he ate him. White Fang ate him, not the other way around. So that problem was literally digested and resolved. Eventually, the famine passed, and he returned to the village, and everything was okay again. And then Grey Beaver decided he was doing a bunch of hunting, and he had a bunch of stuff, and he knew that there were people going up into the Yukon. He went to one of the forts of the white men, and he sold all of his stuff, and he was super rich, 1,000% more well off than he thought he was. And there was this one particular individual who took a liking to White Fang. He saw White Fang, so while Grey Beaver was busy, White Fang, somewhat savage in his nature, would pass the time by tricking the dogs that came off the boats, or the trains rather, I think those are trains, by tricking the new dogs into attacking him, and then watching the other sort of native dogs come along, slaughter and eat the new coming dog. And then this was great entertainment for him. And one of the other permanent residents of this particular town was quite taken with that. He approached Grey Beaver, wanted to pay him money for White Fang. Well, Grey Beaver, up until this point, was very adamant that no money, no dog was White Fang was like no other. He was unique and special, and he would give him up for nothing. So he turned him down. Besides, Grey Beaver had just made a killing and was currently quite rich and well off. So the white man, being what they were and are in some cases, instead of offering him money, brought alcohol and got him addicted to that. And it's kind of, in my opinion, rather apparent that Greybeard became an alcoholic. He was unprepared for the effects of alcohol, and was eventually brought to the point where, instead of giving up White Fang for money, he was quite happy to give him up for a few bottles of alcohol, as he was now completely out of money. He'd bought alcohol with all of it. There was a very tragic, very sad scene. 3 separate occasions, White Fang went back to Greybeaver, and Greybeaver would put a lead on him, tie him down, and return him to the person who had purchased him, and watched him beat poor White Fang, sort of teach him that lesson that I guess Greybeaver taught him when he was a puppy, in the canoe when his mother was being taken away. That's kind of where we left off. White Fang is now in the possession of another man, a white man, and we have yet to know what his true purpose is for White Fang. And that is where we're going to start today. Over here. Yes, sorry. This is part 4, chapter 3. No, it isn't. I started in the wrong place. Let's just skip forward. Part 4, chapter 3, The Reign of Hate, which is definitely a more familiar title for a chapter following the last time we were reading. Under the tutelage of the mad god, White Fang became a fiend. He was kept chained in a pen at the rear of the fort, and here Beauty Smith teased and irritated and drove him wild with petty torments. That's right, Beauty Smith is the name of the guy who bought him from Greybeaver. The man early discovered White Fang's susceptibility to laughter, and made it a point, after painfully tricking him, to laugh at him. This laughter was uproarious and scornful, and at the same time the god pointed his finger derisively at White Fang. At such times, reason fled from White Fang, and in his transports of rage, he was even more mad than Beauty Smith. Formerly, White Fang had been merely the enemy of his kind, withal a ferocious enemy. He now became the enemy of all things, and more ferocious than ever. To such an extent was he tormented that he hated blindly and without the faintest spark of reason. He hated the chain that bound him, the men who peered in at him through the slats of the pen, the dogs that accompanied the men, and that snarled malignantly at him in his helplessness. He hated the very wood of the pen that confined him. And first, last, and most of all, he hated Beauty Smith. But Beauty Smith had a purpose in all that he did to White Fang. One day, a number of men gathered about the pen. Beauty Smith entered, club in hand, and took the chain off from White Fang's neck. When his master had gone out, White Fang turned loose and tore around the pen, trying to get at the men outside. He was magnificently terrible, fully 5 feet in length, and standing 2 1/2 feet at the shoulder. He far outweighed a wolf of corresponding size. From his mother he had inherited the heavier proportions of the dog, so that he weighed, without any fat and without an ounce of superfluous flesh, over 90 pounds. It was all muscle, bone and sinew fighting flesh in the finest condition. The door of the pen was being opened again. White Fang paused. Something unusual was happening. He waited. The door was opened wider. Then a huge dog was thrust inside, and the door was slammed shut behind him. White Fang had never seen such a dog. It was a mastiff. But the size and fierce aspect of the intruder did not deter him. Here was something, not wood nor iron, upon which to wreak his hate. See, I knew it was going to be dogfighting. Yeah, I was right about dogfighting. wreak his hate. There we go. He leaped in with a flash of fangs that ripped down the side of the Mastiff's neck. The Mastiff shook his head, growled hoarsely, and plunged at White Fang. But White Fang was here, there, and everywhere, always evading and eluding, and always leaping in and slashing with his fangs, and leaping out again in time to escape punishment. It's been his M.O. The men outside shouted and applauded, while Beauty Smith, in an ecstasy of delight, gloated over the ripping and mangling performed by White Fang. There was no hope for the Mastiff from the first. He was too ponderous and slow. In the end, while Beauty Smith beat White Fang back with a club, the Mastiff was dragged out by its owner. Then there was a payment of bets, and money clinked in Beauty Smith's hand. White Fang came to look forward eagerly to the gathering of men around his pen. It meant a fight, and this was the only way that was now vouchsafed him. I hate this word. The only way that was now vouchsafed him of expressing the life that was in him. Tormented, incited to hate, he was kept a prisoner so that there was no way of satisfying that hate except at the times his master saw fit to put another dog against him. Beauty Smith had estimated his powers well, for he was invariably the victor. One day, 3 dogs were turned in upon him in succession. Another day, a full-grown wolf, fresh caught from the wild, was shoved in through the door of the pen, and on still another day 2 dogs were set against him at the same time. This was his severest fight, and though in the end he killed them both, he was himself half killed in doing it. Hello, Sage. How are you, buddy? Meow. I need to set up the meow. In the fall of the year, when the first snows were falling and mush ice was running in the river, Beauty Smith took passage for himself and White Fang on a steamboat bound up the Yukon to Dawson. White Fang had now achieved a reputation in the land as the Fighting Wolf. He was known far and wide, and the cage in which he was kept on the steamboat's deck was unusually surrounded by curious men. He raged and snarled at them, or lay quietly and studied them with cold hatred. Why should he not hate them? He never asked himself the question. He knew only hate and lost himself in the passion of it. Life had become a hell to him. He had not been made for the close confinement wild beasts endure at the hands of men, and yet it was in precisely this way that he was treated. Men stared at him, poked sticks between the bars to make him snarl, and then laughed at him. What's this? Oh yes, how was Valana's holiday? She was free for a week, yes. They were his environment, these men, and they were molding the clay of him into a more ferocious thing than had been intended by nature. Nevertheless, nature had given him plasticity. Where many another animal would have died or had its spirit broken, he adjusted himself and lived, and at no expense of the spirit. Possibly Beauty Smith, arch-fiend and tormentor, was capable of breaking White Fang's spirit, but as yet there was no signs of his succeeding. If Beauty Smith had in him a devil, White Fang had another, and the two of them raged against each other unceasingly. In the days before, White Fang had had the wisdom to cower down and submit to a man with a club in his hand, but this wisdom now left him. The mere sight of Beauty Smith was sufficient to send him into transports of fury. And when they came to close quarters, and he had been beaten back by the club, he went on growling and snarling and showing his fangs. The last growl could never be extracted from him. No matter how terribly he was beaten, he had always another growl, and when Beauty Smith gave up and withdrew, the defiant growl followed after him. or White Fang sprang at the bars of the cage, bellowing his hatred. When the steamboat arrived at Dawson, White Fang went ashore, but he still lived a public life in a cage surrounded by curious men. He was exhibited as the Fighting Wolf, and men paid 50 cents in gold dust to see him. He was given no rest. Did he lie down to sleep, he was stirred up by a sharp stick so that the audience might get its money's worth. In order to make the exhibition interesting, he was kept in a rage most of the time. But worse than all this was the atmosphere in which he lived. He was regarded as the most fearful of wild beasts, and this was borne into him through the bars of the cage. Every word, every cautious action on the part of the men impressed upon him his own terrible ferocity. It was so much added fuel to the flame of his fierceness. There could be but one result, and that was that his ferocity fed upon itself and increased. It was another instance of the plasticity of his clay, of his capacity for being molded by the pressure of the environment. In addition to being exhibited, he was a professional fighting animal. At irregular intervals, whenever a fight could be arranged, he was taken out of his cage and led off into the woods a few miles from town. Usually this occurred at night, so as to avoid interference from the mounted police of the territory. After a few hours of waiting, when daylight had come, the audience and the dog with which he was to fight arrived. In this manner it came about that he fought all sizes and breeds of dogs. It was a savage land. The men were savage, and the fights were usually to the death. Since White Fang continued to fight, it is obvious that it was the other dogs that died. He never knew defeat. His early training when he fought with Lip Lip and the whole puppy pack stood him in good stead. There was the tenacity with which he clung to the earth. No dog could make him lose his footing. This was the favorite trick of the wolf breeds, to rush in upon him, either directly or with an unexpected swerve in the hope of striking his shoulder and overthrowing him. Mackenzie hounds, Eskimo and Labrador dogs, huskies and Malamutes all tried it on him, and all failed. He was never known to lose his footing. Men told this to one another and looked each time to see it happen, but White Fang always disappointed them. Then there was his lightning quickness. It gave him a tremendous advantage over his antagonists. No matter what their fighting experience, they had never encountered a dog that moved so swiftly as he. Also to be reckoned with was the immediateness of his attack. The average dog was accustomed to the preliminaries of snarling and bristling and growling, and the average dog was knocked off his feet and finished before he had begun to fight or recovered from his surprise. So often did this happen that it became the custom to hold White Fang until the other dog went through its preliminaries. It was good and ready, and even made the first attack. But greatest of all the advantages in White Fang's favor was his experience. He knew more about fighting than did any of the dogs that faced him. He had fought more fights, knew how to meet more tricks and methods, and had more tricks himself, while his own method was scarcely to be improved upon. As the time went by, he had fewer and fewer fights. Men despaired of matching with him an equal, and Beauty Smith was compelled to pit wolves against him. These were trapped by the natives for the purpose, and a fight between White Fang and a wolf was always sure to draw a crowd. Once, a full-grown female lynx was secured, and this time White Fang fought for his life. Her quickness matched his, her ferocity equaled his, while he fought with his fangs alone, and she fought with her sharp-clawed feet as well. But after the lynx, all fighting ceased for White Fang. There were no more animals with which to fight. At least, there was none considered worthy of fighting him. So he remained on exhibition until spring, when one Tim Keenan a faro dealer arrived in the land. With him came the first bulldog that had ever entered the Klondike. That this dog and White Fang should come together was inevitable, and for a week the anticipated fight was the mainspring of conversation in certain quarters of the town. Chapter 4: The Clinging Death. Beauty Smith slipped the chain from his neck and stepped back. For once, White Fang did not make an immediate attack. He stood still, ears pricked forward, alert and curious, surveying the strange animal that faced him. He had never seen such a dog before. Tim Keenan shoved the bulldog forward with a muttered, "Go to it." The animal waddled towards the center of the circle, short and squat and ungainly. He came to a stop and blinked across at White Fang. There were cries from the crowd of, "Go to him, Cherokee! Sick him, Cherokee! Eat him up!" But Cherokee did not seem anxious to fight. He turned his head and blinked at the men who shouted, at the same time wagging his stump of a tail good-naturedly. "Those aren't good doggos." He was not afraid, but merely lazy. Besides, it did not seem to him that it was intended he should fight with the dog he saw before him. He was not used to fighting with that kind of dog, and he was waiting for them to bring on the real dog. Tim Keenan stepped in and bent over Cherokee, fondling him on both sides of his shoulders with his hands that rubbed against the grain of the hair and made slight pushing forward movements. These were so many suggestions. Also, their effect was irritating, for Cherokee began to growl, very softly, deep down in his throat. There was a correspondence in rhythm between the growls and the movements of the man's hands. The growl rose in the throat with the culmination of each forward-pushing movement and ebbed down to start up afresh with the beginning of the next movement. The end of each movement was the accent of the rhythm, the movement ending abruptly and the growling rising with a jerk. This was not without its effect on White Fang. The hair began to rise on his neck and across the shoulders. Tim Keenan gave a final shove forward and stepped back again. As the impetus that carried Cherokee forward died down, he continued to go forward of his own volition, in a swift, bow-legged run. Then White Fang struck. A cry of startled admiration went up. He had covered the distance and gone in more like a cat than a dog, and with the same cat-like swiftness he had slashed with his fangs and leaped clear. The bulldog was bleeding back of one ear from a rip in his thick neck. He gave no sign, did not even snarl, but turned and followed after White Fang. The display on both sides, the quickness of the one and the steadiness of the other, had excited the partisan spirit of the crowd. And the men were making new bets and increasing original bets. Again and yet again, White Fang sprang in, slashed, and got away untouched, and still his strange foe followed after him, without too great haste, not slowly, but deliberately and determinedly, in a businesslike sort of way. There was purpose in his method, something for him to do that he was intent upon doing and from which nothing could distract him. His whole demeanor, every action, was stamped with this purpose. It puzzled White Fang. Never had he seen such a dog. It had no hair protection. It was soft and bled easily. There was no thick mat of fur to baffle White Fang's teeth, as they were often baffled by dogs of his own breed. Each time that his teeth struck, they sank easily into the yielding flesh, while the animal did not seem able to defend itself. Another disconcerting thing was that it made no outcry, such as he had been accustomed to with the other dogs he had fought. Beyond a growl or a grunt, the dog took its punishment silently, and never did it flag in its pursuit of him. Not that Cherokee was slow. He could turn and whirl swiftly enough, but White Fang was never there. White Fang was never there. Cherokee was puzzled too. He had never fought before with a dog with which he could not close. The desire to close had always been mutual, but here was a dog that kept at a distance, dancing and dodging here and there and all about. And when it did get its teeth into him, he did not hold on but let go instantly and darted away again. But White Fang could not get at the soft underside of the throat. The bulldog stood too short, while its massive jaws were an added protection. White Fang darted in and out unscathed, while Cherokee's wounds increased. Both sides of his neck and head were ripped and slashed. He bled freely, but showed no signs of being disconcerted. He continued his plodding pursuit, though once, for the moment baffled, he came to a full stop and blinked at the men who looked on, at the same time wagging his stump of a tail as an expression of his willingness to fight. In that moment, White Fang was in upon him and out, in passing, ripping his trimmed remnant of an ear. With a slight manifestation of anger, Cherokee took up the pursuit again, running on the inside of the circle while White Fang was running on the inside of the circle White Fang was making and striving to fasten his deadly grip on White Fang's throat. The bulldog missed by a hair's breadth, and cries of praise went up as White Fang doubled suddenly out of danger in the opposite direction. A time went by. White Fang still danced on, dodging and doubling, leaping in and out and ever inflicting damage. And still the bulldog, with grim certitude, toiled after him. Sooner or later, he would accomplish his purpose. Get the grip that would win the battle. In the meantime, he accepted all the punishment the other could deal him. His tufts of ears had become tassels, his neck and shoulders were slashed in a score of places, and his very lips were cut and bleeding. All from these lightning snaps that were beyond his foreseeing and guarding. Time and again White Fang attempted to knock Cherokee off his feet, but the difference in their height was too great. Cherokee was too squat, too close to the ground. White Fang tried the trick once too often. The chance came in one of his quick doublings and counter-circlings. He caught Cherokee with head turned away as he whirled more slowly. The shoulder was exposed. White Fang drove in upon it, but his own shoulder was high above, while he struck with such force that his momentum carried him on across over the other's body. For the first time in his fighting history, men saw White Fang lose his footing. His body turned, a half somersault in the air, and he would have been in the air, and he would have landed on his back had he not twisted cat-like, still in the air, in the effort to bring his feet to the earth. As it was, he struck heavily on his side. The next instant he was on his feet, but in that instant, Cherokee's teeth closed on his throat. It was not a good grip, being too low toward the chest, but Cherokee held on. White Fang sprang to his feet and tore wildly around, trying to shake off the bulldog's body. It made him frantic, this clinging, dragging weight. It bound his movements, restricted his freedom. It was like the trap, and all his instinct resented it and revolted against it. It was a mad revolt. For several minutes he was, to all intents, insane. The basic life that was in him took charge of him. The will to exist of his body surged over him. He was dominated by this mere flesh love of life. All intelligence was gone. It was as though he had no brain. His reason was unseated by the blind yearning of the flesh to exist and move. At all hazards to move, to continue to move, for movement was the expression of its existence. We learned that in the beginning of the novel. Round and round he went, whirling and turning and reversing, trying to shake off the 50-pound weight that dragged at his throat. The bulldog did little but keep his grip. Sometimes and rarely he managed to get his feet to the earth and for a moment to brace himself against White Fang, but the next moment his footing would be lost and he would be dragged around in the whirl of one of White Fang's mad gyrations. Cherokee identified himself with his instinct. He knew that he was doing the right thing by holding on, and there came to him certain blissful thrills of satisfaction. At such moments, he even closed his eyes and allowed his body to be hurled hither and thither, willy-nilly, careless of any hurt that might thereby come to it. That did not count. The grip was the thing. The grip he kept. White Fang ceased only when he had tired himself out. He could do nothing, and he could not understand. Never in all his fighting had this thing happened. The dogs he had fought with did not fight that way. With them it was snap and slash and get away. Snap and slash and get away. He lay partly on his side, panting for breath. Cherokee, still holding his grip, urged against him, trying to get him over entirely on his side. White Fang resisted, and he could feel the jaws shifting their grip, slightly relaxing and coming together again in a chewing movement. Each shift brought the grip closer to his throat. The bulldog's method was to hold what he had, and when opportunity favored, to work in for more. Opportunity favored when White Fang remained quiet. When White Fang struggled, Cherokee was content merely to hold on. Yeah, bulldogs were bred to have a locking jaw. That's why they can hold on. The bulging back of Cherokee's neck was the only portion of his body that White Fang's teeth could reach. He got hold toward the base where the neck comes out from the shoulders, but he did not know the chewing method of fighting, nor were his jaws adapted to it. He spasmodically ripped and tore with his fangs for a space. Then a change in their position diverted him. The bulldog had managed to roll him over on his back, and still hanging onto his throat was on top of him. Like a cat, White Fang bowed his hindquarters in, and, with the feet digging into his enemy's abdomen above him, he began to claw with long, tearing strokes. Cherokee might well have been disemboweled had he not quickly pivoted on his grip and got his body off of White Fang's, and at right angles to it. There was no escaping that grip. It was like fate itself, and as inexorable. Slowly, it shifted up along the jugular. All that saved White Fang from death was the loose skin of his neck and the thick fur that covered it. This served to form a large roll in Cherokee's mouth, the fur of which well nigh defied his teeth. But bit by bit, whenever the chance offered, he was getting more of the loose skin and fur in his mouth. The result was that he was slowly throttling White Fang. The latter's breath was drawn with greater and greater difficulty as the moments went by. It began to look as though the battle were over. The backers of Cherokee waxed jubilant and offered ridiculous odds. White Fang's backers were correspondingly depressed and refused bets of 10-1 and 20-1. The one man was rash enough to close a wager of 50-1. This man was Beauty Smith. He took a step into the ring and pointed his finger at White Fang, and he began to laugh derisively and scornfully. This produced the desired effect. White Fang went wild with rage. He called up his reserves of strength and gained his feet. As he struggled around the ring, the 50 pounds of his foe dragging on his throat, his anger passed on into panic. The basic life of him dominated him again, and his intelligence fled before the will of his flesh to live. Round and back again, stumbling and falling and rising, even uprearing at times on his hind legs and lifting his foe clear of the earth. He struggled vainly to shake off the clinging death. At last he fell, toppling backward, exhausted, and the bulldog promptly shifted his grip, getting in closer. Mangling more and more of the fur-folded flesh, throttling White Fang more severely than ever. Shouts of applause went up for the victor, and there were many cries of "Cherokee, Cherokee." To this Cherokee responded by vigorous wagging of the stump of his tail. But the clamor of approval did not distract him. There was no sympathetic relation between his tail and his massive jaws. The one might wag, but the other held their terrible grip on White Fang's throat. It was at this time that a diversion came to the spectators. There was a jingle of bells. Dog mushers' cries were heard. Everybody, save Beauty Smith, looked apprehensively, the fear of the police strong upon them. But they saw, up the trail, and not down, 2 men running with sled and dogs. They were evidently coming down the creek from some prospecting trip. At sight of the crowd, they stopped their dogs and came over and joined it, curious to see the cause of the excitement. The dog musher wore a mustache, but the other, a taller and younger man, was smooth-shaven, his skin rosy from the pounding of his blood and the running in the frosty air. We're going to take an ad break right there, see what happens when these newcomers have arrived, what they will do. How White Fang can possibly survive, whoever knows. Maybe part 4 is a story about White Fang instead of, White Fang himself. See you soon. And welcome back from ads, everybody. Let's see, where were we? Right, the 2 men were on the dog side, were coming up the trail. And were joining the spectators. White Fang had practically ceased struggling. Now and again he resisted spasmodically and to no purpose. He could get little air, and that little grew less and less under the merciless grip that ever tightened. In spite of his armor of fur, the great vein of his throat would have long since been torn open. And not the first grip of the bulldog had been so low. Had not the first grip of the bulldog been so low down as to be practically on the chest, it had taken Cherokee a long time to shift that grip upward. And this had also tended further to clog his jaws with fur and skin fold. In the meantime, the abysmal brute in Beauty Smith had been rising into his brain and mastering the small bit of sanity that he had possessed at best. When he saw White Fang's eyes begin to glaze, he knew beyond doubt that the fight was lost. Then he broke loose. He sprang upon White Fang and began to savagely kick him. There were hisses from the crowd and cries of protest, but that was all. While this went on and Beauty Smith continued to kick White Fang, there was a commotion in the crowd. Imagine that. Your dog that you're abusing went into fight, loses one fight, and you kick him literally while he's dying. Jesus, what a monster. The tall, young newcomer was forcing his way through, shouldering men right and left without ceremony or gentleness. Yeah, people are evil. That's very true. I had a manager once that said people are animals. That was just people going to the theater. When he broke through into the ring, Beauty Smith was just in the act of delivering another kick. All his weight was on one foot, and he was in a state of unstable equilibrium. At that moment, the newcomer's fist landed a smashing blow full in his face. Beauty Smith's remaining left leg lifted the ground, and his whole body seemed to lift into the air as he turned over backward and struck the snow. The newcomer turned upon the crowd. "You cowards!" he cried. "You beasts!" He was in a rage himself, a sane rage. His gray eyes seemed metallic and steel-like as they flashed upon the crowd. Beauty Smith regained his feet and came toward him, sniffling and cowardly. The newcomer did not understand. He did not know how abject a coward the other was, and thought he was coming back intent on fighting. So, with a "you beast," he smashed Beauty Smith over backward with a second blow to the face. Beauty Smith decided that the snow was the safest place for him and lay where he had fallen, making no effort to get up. Also probably helped with the swelling. Come on, Matt, lend me a hand, the newcomer called to the dog musher who had followed him into the ring. Both men bent over the dogs. Matt took hold of White Fang, ready to pull when Cherokee's jaws should be loosened. This the younger man endeavored to accomplish by clutching the bulldog's jaws in his hands and trying to spread them. It was a vain undertaking. As he pulled and tugged and wrenched, he kept exclaiming that with every exhaustion of breath, "Beasts!" The crowd began to grow unruly, and some of the men were protesting against the spoiling of the sport, but they were silenced when the newcomer lifted his head from his work for a moment and glared at them. "You damn beasts!" he finally exploded and went back to his task. "It's no use, Mr. Scott. You can't break 'em apart that way," Matt said at last. The pair paused and surveyed the locked dogs. "Ain't bleeding much," Matt announced. "Ain't got all the way in yet." "But he's liable to any moment," Scott answered. "There, did you see that? He shifted his grip in a bit." The younger man's excitement and apprehension for White Fang was growing. He struck Cherokee about the head savagely again and again, but that did not loosen the jaws. Cherokee wagged the stump of his tail, an advertisement that he understood the meaning of the blows, but that he knew he was himself in the right and only doing his duty by keeping his grip. "Won't some of you help?" Scott cried desperately at the crowd. But no help was offered. Instead, the crowd had begun sarcastically to cheer him on and showered him with facetious advice. "You'll have to get a pry," Matt counseled. The other reached into the holster at his hip, drew his revolver, and tried to thrust its muzzle between the bulldog's jaws. He shoved and shoved hard until the grating of the steel against the locked teeth could be distinctly heard. Both men were on their knees, bending over the dogs. Tim Keenan strode into the ring. He paused beside Scott and touching him on the shoulder, saying ominously, "Don't break them teeth, stranger." "Then I'll break his neck," Scott retorted, continuing his shoving and wedging with the revolver muzzle. "I said don't break them teeth," the faro dealer repeated more ominously than before. But if it was a bluff he intended, it did not work. Scott never desisted from his efforts, though he looked up coolly and asked, "Your dog?" The faro dealer grunted. "Then get in here and break his grip." "Well, stranger," the other drawled irritatingly, "I don't mind telling you that's something I ain't worked out for myself. I don't know how to turn the trick." "Then get out of the way," was the reply, "and don't bother me. I'm busy." Tim Keenan continued standing over him, but Scott took no further notice of his presence. He had managed to get the muzzle in between the jaws on one side and was trying to get it out between the jaws on the other side. This accomplished, he pried gently and carefully, loosening the jaws a bit at a time, while Matt, a bit at a time, extricated White Fang's mangled neck. "Stand by to receive your dog," was Scott's peremptory order to Cherokee's owner. The faro dealer stooped down obediently and got a firm hold on Cherokee. There is a way, I think, to open the mouth, and it's not by force. It's one of those you catch more hives with more flies with honey type of thing, right? You have to calm the dog down. The dogs were drawn apart, the bulldog struggling vigorously. "Take him away," Scott commanded, and Tim Keenan dragged Cherokee back into the crowd. White Fang made several ineffectual efforts to get up. Once he gained his feet, but his legs were too weak to sustain him, and he slowly wilted and sank back into the snow. His eyes were half closed, and the surface of them was glassy. His jaws were apart, and through them the tongue protruded, draggled and limp. To all appearances, he looked like a dog that had been strangled to death. Matt examined him. "Just about hauled in," he announced, "but he's breathing all right." Beauty Smith had regained his feet and come over to look at White Fang. "Matt, how much is she a good sled dog worth?" Scott asked. So, how much is a good sled dog worth? Scott asked. The dog musher, still on his knees and stooped over White Fang, calculated for a moment. $300, he answered. And how much for one that's all chewed up like this one? Scott asked, nudging White Fang with his foot. Half of that, was the dog musher's judgment. Scott turned upon Beauty Smith. Did you hear, Mr. Beast? I'm going to take your dog from you, and I'm going to give you $150 for him. He opened his pocketbook and counted out the bills. Beauty Smith put his hands behind his back, refusing to touch the proffered money. I ain't a-sellin', he said. Oh, yes, you are, the other assured him, because I'm buying. Here's your money. The dog's mine. Beauty Smith, his hands still behind him, began to back away. Scott sprang toward him, drawing his fist back to strike. Beauty Smith cowered down in anticipation of the blow. Yeah, I ain't asking, that's right. I've got my rights, he whimpered. You forfeited your rights to own that dog, was the rejoinder. Are you going to take the money, or do I have to hit you again? All right, Beauty Smith spoke up with the alacrity of fear. But I take the money under protest, he added. My dog's a mint. I ain't a-going to be robbed. A man's got his rights. Correct, Scott answered, passing the money over to him. A man's got his rights. But you're not a man. You're a beast. Wait till I get back to Dawson, Beauty Smith threatened. I'll have the law on you. If you open your mouth when you go back to Dawson, I'll have you run out of town, understood? Beauty Smith replied with a grunt. Understand, the other thundered with abrupt fierceness. Yes, Beauty Smith grunted, shrinking away. Yes, what? Yes, sir, Beauty Smith snarled. Sorry, yes, sir, Beauty Smith snarled. Look out, he'll bite, someone shouted, and a guffaw of laughter went up. Scott turned his back on him and returned to help the dog musher, who was working over White Fang. Some of the men were already departing. Others stood in groups, looking on and talking. Tim Keenan joined one of the groups. Who's that mug? He asked. Weedon Scott, someone answered. And who in the hell is Weedon Scott? The faro dealer demanded. Oh, one of them crackerjack mining experts. He's in with all the big bugs. If you want to keep out of trouble, you'll steer clear of him. That's all. That's my talk. He's all hunky with the officials. The gold commissioner's a special pal of his. I thought he must be somebody, was the faro dealer's comment. That's why I kept my hands off him at the start. Yeah, it pays to follow the crowd sometimes. Chapter 5, The Indomitable. It's hopeless, Weedon Scott confessed. He sat on the step of his cabin and stared at the dog musher, who responded with a shrug that it was equally hopeless. Together, they looked at White Fang at the end of his stretched chain, bristling, snarling, ferocious, straining to get at the sled dogs. Having received sundry lessons from Matt, and lessons being imparted by means of a club, the sled dogs had learned to leave White Fang alone. And even then they were lying down at a distance, apparently oblivious of his existence. It's a wolf, and there's no taming it, Weedon Scott announced. Oh, I don't know about that, Matt objected. Might be a lot of dog in him for all you can tell, but there's one thing I know sure, and that there's no getting away from. The dog musher paused and nodded his head confidentially at a moosehide mountain. Well, don't be a miser with what you know, Scott said sharply, after waiting a suitable length of time. Spit it out, what is it? The dog musher indicated White Fang with a backward thrust of his thumb. Wolf or dog, it's all the same. He's been tamed ready. No. I tell you, yes, and broke to harness. Look close there. Do you see the marks across the chest? You're right, Matt. He was a sled dog before Beauty Smith got hold of him. And there's not much reason against his being a sled dog again. What do you think? Scott queried eagerly. And the hope died down as he added, shaking his head. We've had him 2 weeks now. And if anything, he's wilder than ever at the present moment. Give him a chance, Matt counseled. Turn him loose for a spell. The other looked at him incredulously. Yes, Matt went on. I know you tried to, but you didn't take a club. You try it then. The dog musher secured a club and went over to the chained animal. White Fang watched the club after the manner of a caged lion watching the whip of its trainer. See him keep his eye on that club, Matt said. That's a good sign. He's no fool. Don't dast tackle me so long as I got that club handy. He's not clean crazy, sure. As the man's hand approached his neck, White Fang bristled and snarled and crouched down. But while he eyed the approaching hand, he at the same time contrived to keep track of the club in the other hand, suspended threateningly above him. Matt unsnapped the chain from the collar and stepped back. White Fang could scarcely realize that he was free. Many months had gone by since he passed into the possession of Beauty Smith, and in all that period he had never known a moment of freedom, except at the times he had been loosed to fight with other dogs. Immediately after such fights he had always been imprisoned again. He did not know what to make of it. Perhaps some new devilry of the gods was about to be perpetrated on him. He walked slowly and cautiously, prepared to be assailed at any moment. He did not know what to do. It was all so unprecedented. He took the precaution to sheer off from the two watching gods and walked carefully to the corner of the cabin. Nothing happened. He was plainly perplexed, and he came back again, pausing a dozen feet away and regarding the two men intently. Won't he run away? His new owner asked. Matt shrugged his shoulders. Got to take a gamble. Only way to find out is to find out. Poor devil, Scott murmured pityingly. What he needs is some show of human kindness, he added, turning and going into the cabin. He came out with a piece of meat, which he tossed to White Fang. He sprang away from it, and from a distance studied it suspiciously. He you, Major, Matt shouted warningly, but too late. Major had made a spring for the meat. I guess that's on one of the other dogs. At the instant his jaws closed on it, White Fang struck him. He was overthrown. Matt rushed in, but quicker than he was White Fang. Major staggered to his feet, but the blood spouting from his throat reddened the snow in a widening path. It's too bad, but it served him right, Scott said hastily. But Matt's foot had already started on its way to kick White Fang. There was a leap, a flash of teeth, a sharp exclamation. White Fang, snarling fiercely, scrambled backward for several yards while Matt stooped and investigated his leg. He got me all right, he announced, pointing to the torn trousers and undercloths and the growing stain of red. I told you it was hopeless, Matt, Scott said in a discouraged voice. I've thought about it off and on, while not wanting to think of it, but we've come to it now. It's the only thing to do. As he talked, with reluctant movements he drew his revolver, threw open the cylinder, and assured himself of its contents. Look here, Mr. Scott, Matt objected. That dog's been through hell. You can't expect him to come out a white and shining angel. Give him time. Look at Major, the other rejoined. The dog musher surveyed the stricken dog. He had sunk down on the snow in the circle of his blood and was plainly in the last gasp. Served him right. You said so yourself, Mr. Scott. He tried to take White Fang's meat, and he's dead-o. And he's dead, capital O. He's dead-o, and he's dead-o. Here's the thing. It's not Major's fault. It's Scott's fault. He threw the meat in the wrong spot. He should have known how his dogs might have reacted to that. Anyways, that was to be expected. I wouldn't give two whoops in hell for a dog that wouldn't fight for his own meat. But look at yourself, Matt. It's all right about the dogs. It's all right about the dogs, but we must draw the line somewhere. Try, it was a series of mistakes. Yeah, no, it's totally, it's it's true. The situation's complicated, but Scott threw the meat in the wrong spot, which caused confusion. It's one thing is certainly true. It's always the human's fault. I'm not dumping on Scott here. I think it was just a mistake. Certainly it wasn't malicious. It's resulted in a tragedy, but yeah, it's always the human's fault. Let's see. But look at yourself, Matt. It's all right about the dogs, but we must draw the line somewhere. Serve me right, Matt argued stubbornly. What did I want to kick him for? You said yourself that he'd done right, and I had no right to kick him. It would be a mercy to kill him, Scott insisted. He's untamable. Now look here, Mr. Scott. Give the poor devil a fighting chance. He ain't had no chance yet. He's just come through hell, and this is the first time he's been loose. Give him a fair chance, and if he don't deliver the goods, I'll kill him myself. There. God knows I don't want to kill him or have him killed, Scott answered, putting away the revolver. We'll let him run loose and see what kindness can do for him. And here's a try at it. He walked over to White Fang and began talking to him gently and soothingly. Better have a club handy, Matt warned. Scott shook his head and went on trying to win White Fang's confidence. That's a bad way to do that, but okay. White Fang was suspicious. Something was impending. He had killed this god's dog, bitten his companion god, and what else was to be expected than some terrible punishment? But in the face of it, he was indomitable. He bristled and showed his teeth, his eyes vigilant, his whole body wary and prepared for anything. The god had no club, so he suffered him to approach quite near. The god's hand had come out and was descending upon his head. White Fang shrank together and grew tense as he crouched under it. Here was danger, some treachery or something. He knew the hands of the gods, their proved mastery, their cunning to hurt. Besides, there was his old antipathy to being touched. He snarled more menacingly, crouched still lower, and still the hand descended. This is asking to be bitten, by the way. If you are trying to handle an animal, a dog, in this manner, you will be bitten. Don't do this. He did not want to bite the hand, and he endured the peril of it until his instinct surged up in him, mastering him with his insatiable yearning for life. Weedon Scott had believed that he was quick enough to avoid any snap or slash, but he had yet to learn the remarkable quickness of White Fang, who struck with the certainty and swiftness of a coiled snake. Scott cried out sharply with surprise, catching his torn hand and holding it tightly in his other hand. Matt uttered a great oath and sprang to his side. White Fang crouched down and backed away, bristling, showing his fangs, his eyes malignant with menace. Now he could expect a beating as fearful as any he had received from Beauty Smith. Yeah, see, don't do that. Like, this is just the natural thing. You have to get the dog's trust first. Here, what are you doing? Scott cried suddenly. Matt had dashed into the cabin and come out with a rifle. Nothing, he said slowly, with a careless calmness that was assumed. Only going to keep that promise I made. I reckon it's up to me to kill him as I said I'd do. No, you don't. Yes, I do. Watch me. As Matt had pleaded for White Fang when he had been bitten, it was now Weedon Scott's turn to plead. You said to give him a chance. Well, give it to him. We've only just started, and we can't quit at the beginning. It served me right this time, and look at him. White Fang, near the corner of the cabin and 40 feet away, was snarling with blood-curdling viciousness. Not at Scott, but at the dog musher. Well, I'll be everlastingly gosh swoggled, was the dog musher's expression of astonishment. Look at that intelligence of him, Scott went on hastily. He knows the meaning of firearms as well as you do. He's got intelligence, and we've got to give that intelligence a chance. Put up the gun. All right, I'm willing, Matt agreed, leaning the rifle against the woodpile. But will you look at that? He exclaimed the next moment. White Fang had quieted down and ceased snarling. This is worth investigating. Watch. Matt reached for the rifle, and at the same moment, White Fang snarled. He stepped away from the rifle, and White Fang's lifted lips descended, covering his teeth. It's just like Bomb. Now, just for fun, Matt took the rifle and began slowly to raise it to his shoulder. White Fang's snarling began with movement and increased as the movement approached its culmination. But the moment before the rifle came to a level on him, he leaped sideways behind the corner of the cabin. Matt stood, staring along the sights at the empty space of snow which had been occupied by White Fang. The dog musher put the rifle down solemnly, then turned and looked at his employer. I agree with you, Mr. Scott. That dog's too intelligent to kill. Chapter 6, The Love Master. That's a subject change. As White Fang watched Weedon Scott approach, he bristled and snarled to advertise that he would not submit to punishment. 24 hours had passed since he had slashed open the hand that was now bandaged and held up by a sling to keep the blood out of it. In the past, White Fang had experienced delayed punishments, and he apprehended that such a one was about to befall him. How could it be otherwise? He had committed what was to him sacrilege, sunk his fangs into the holy flesh of a god, and of a white-skinned superior god at that. Gross barf. In the nature of things, and of intercourse with gods, something terrible awaited him. The gods sat down several feet away. White Fang could see nothing dangerous in that. When the dogs administered punishment, they stood on their legs. Besides, this god had no club, no whip, no firearm. And furthermore, he himself was free. No chain nor stick bound him. He could escape into safety while the god was scrambling to his feet. In the meantime, he would wait and see. The god remained quiet, made no movement, and White Fang's snarl slowly dwindled to a growl that ebbed down his throat and ceased. Then the god spoke, and at the first sound of his voice the hair rose on White Fang's neck and the growl rushed up in his throat. But the god made no hostile movement and went on calmly talking. For a time, White Fang growled in unison with him, a correspondence of rhythm being established between growl and voice. But the god talked on interminably. He talked to White Fang as White Fang had never been talked to before. He talked softly and soothingly, with a gentleness that somehow, somewhere, touched White Fang. In spite of himself and all the prickling warnings of his instinct, White Fang began to have confidence in this god. He had a feeling of security that was belied by all his experience with men. After a long time, the god got up and went into the cabin. White Fang scanned him apprehensively when he came out. He had neither whip nor club nor weapon, nor was his uninjured hand behind his back hiding something. He sat down as before in the same spot, several feet away. He held out a piece of meat. White Fang prickled his ears and investigated it suspiciously, managing to look at the same time both at the meat and the god. Alert for any overt act, his body tense and ready to spring away at the first sign of hostility. Still the punishment delayed. The god merely held near to his nose a piece of meat, and about the meat there seemed nothing wrong. Still White Fang suspected, and though the meat was proffered to him with short, inviting thrusts of the hand, he refused to touch it. The gods were all-wise, and there was no telling what masterful treachery lurked behind the apparently harmless piece of meat. In past experience, especially in dealing with squaws, meat and punishment had often been disastrously related. In the end, the god tossed the meat on the snow at White Fang's feet. He smelled the meat carefully, but he did not look at it. While he smelled it, he kept his eyes on the god. Nothing happened. He took the meat into his mouth and swallowed it. Still nothing happened. The god was actually offering him another piece of meat. Again he refused to take it from the hand, and again it was tossed to him. This was repeated a number of times, but there came a time when the god refused to toss it. He kept it in his hand and steadfastly proffered it. The meat was good meat, and White Fang was hungry. Bit by bit, infinitely cautious, he approached the hand. At last the time came that he decided to eat the meat from the hand. He never took his eyes from the god, thrusting his head forward with his ears flattened back and hair involuntarily rising and cresting on his neck. Also, a low growl rumbled in his throat as warning that he was not to be trifled with. He ate the meat, and still nothing happened. Piece by piece, he ate all the meat, and nothing happened. Still the punishment delayed. Hello, Queen. Thank you for the hydration. Water. He licked his chops and waited. The god went on talking, in his voice with kindness, something of which White Fang had no experience whatever. And within him it aroused feelings which he had likewise never experienced before. These are the things that were never risen within him. We had this conversation when he was owned by Grey Beaver. He was aware of a certain strange satisfaction, as though some need were being gratified, as though some void in his being were being filled. Then again came the prod of his instinct and the warning of past experience. The gods were ever crafty, and they had unguessed ways of attaining their ends. Ah, he had thought so. There it came now, the god's hand, cunning to hurt, thrusting out at him, descending upon his head. But the god went on talking. His voice was soft and soothing. In spite of the menacing hand, the voice inspired confidence, and in spite of the assuring voice, the hand inspired distrust. White Fang was torn by conflicting feelings, impulses. It seemed he would fly to pieces, so terrible was the control he was exerting, holding together by an unwanted indecision the counterforces that struggled within him for mastery. Yeah, it's still too early to try this. I probably wouldn't try petting him for a week. Like after they start doing this kind of conditioning. Not that I'm an expert on dog training. He compromised. He snarled and bristled and flattened his ears, but he neither snapped nor sprang away. The hand descended. Nearer and nearer it came. It touched the ends of his upstanding hair. He shrank down under it. It followed down after him, pressing more closely against him. Shrinking, almost shriveling, he still managed to hold himself together. It was a torment. This hand that touched him and violated his instinct, he could not forget in a day all the evil that had been wrought him at the hands of men. But it was the will of the god, and he strove to submit. The hand lifted and descended again in a patting, caressing movement. This continued, but every time the hand lifted, the hair lifted under it, and every time the hand descended, the ears flattened down and a cavernous growl surged in his throat. White Fang growled, and growled with insistent warning. By this means he announced that he was prepared to retaliate for any hurt he might receive. There was no telling when the god's ulterior motive might be disclosed. At any moment that soft, confidence-inspiring voice might break forth into a roar of wrath. That gentle and caressing hand transform itself into a vice-like grip to hold him helpless and administer punishment. But the god talked on softly, and ever the hand rose and fell with non-hostile pats. White Fang experienced dual feelings. It was distasteful to his instinct. It restrained him, opposed the will of him toward personal liberty. And yet it was not physically painful. On the contrary, it was even pleasant in a physical way. The patting movement slowly and carefully changed to a rubbing of the ears about their bases, and the physical pleasure even increased a little. Yet he continued to fear, and he stood on guard, expectant of unguessed evil, alternately suffering and enjoying as one feeling or the other came uppermost and swayed him. "Well, I'll be gosh swoggled," so spoke Matt, coming out of the cabin, his sleeves rolled up, a pan of dirty dishwater in his hands, arrested in the act of emptying the pan by the sight of Weedon Scott patting White Fang. At this instant, his voice broke the silence. White Fang leaped back, snarling savagely at him. Matt regarded his employer with grieved disapproval. "If you don't mind my expressing my feelings, Mr. Scott, I'll make free to say you're 17 kinds of a damn fool and all of them different, and then some." Weedon Scott smiled with a superior air, gained his feet, and walked over to White Fang. He talked soothingly to him, but not for long, and slowly put out his hand, rested it on White Fang's head, and resumed the interrupted patting. White Fang endured it, keeping his eyes fixed suspiciously, not upon the man that patted him, but upon the man that stood in the doorway. "You may be a number one tip-top mining expert, all right, the dog musher delivered himself oracularly, but you missed the chance of your life when you was a boy and didn't run off and join a circus." "Oh, itchy ear. Itchy ear. Oh, less itchy." White Fang snarled at the sound of his voice, but this time did not leap away from under the hand that was caressing his head and the back of his neck with long, soothing strokes. It was the beginning of the end for White Fang, the ending of the old life and the reign of hate. A new and incomprehensibly fairer life was dawning. It required much thinking and endless patience on the part of Weedon Scott to accomplish this, and on the part of White Fang it required nothing less than a revolution. He had to ignore the urges and promptings of instinct and reason, defy experience, give the lie to life itself. Life as he had known it not only had no place in it for much that he now did, but all the currents had gone counter to those which he now abandoned himself. In short, when all things were considered, he had to achieve an orientation far vaster than the one he achieved at the time he came voluntarily in from the wild and accepted Grey Beaver as his lord. At that time he was a mere puppy, soft from the making, without form, ready for the thumb of circumstance to begin its work upon him. But now it was different. The thumb of circumstance had done its work only too well. By it he had been formed and hardened into the fighting wolf, fierce and implacable, unloving and unlovable. To accomplish the change was like a reflux of being, and this when the plasticity of youth was no longer his, when the fiber of him had become tough and knotty, when the warp and the woof of him had made him an adamantine texture, harsh and unyielding, when the face of his spirit had become iron, and all his instincts and axioms had crystallized into set rules, cautions, dislikes, and desires. Yet again, in this new orientation, it was the thumb of circumstance that pressed and prodded him, softening that which had become hard and remolding it into fairer form. Weedon Scott was, in truth, this thumb. He had gone to the roots of White Fang's nature, and with kindness touched to life potencies that had languished and well-nigh perished. One such potency was love. It took the place of like, which latter had been the highest feeling that thrilled him in his intercourse with the gods. But this love did not come in a day. It began with like, and out of it slowly developed. White Fang did not run away, though he was allowed to remain loose, because he liked his new god. This was certainly better than the life he had lived in the cage of Beauty Smith, and it was necessary that he should have some god. The lordship of man was a need of his nature. The seal of his dependency on man had been set upon him in that early day when he turned back on the wild and crawled to Grey Beaver's feet to receive the expected beating. This seal had been stamped upon him again, and ineradicably, on his second return from the wild, when the long famine was over and there was fish once more in the village of Grey Beaver. And so, because he needed a god, and because he preferred Weedon Scott to Beauty Smith, White Fang remained. In acknowledgement of fealty, he proceeded to take upon himself the guardianship of his master's property. He prowled about the cabin while the sled dog slept, and the first night visitor to the cabin fought him off with a club until Weedon Scott came to the rescue. It's old habits, I guess. But White Fang soon learned to differentiate between thieves and honest men, to appraise the true value of step and carriage. The man who traveled loud stepping the direct line to the cabin door he let alone, though he watched him vigilantly until the door opened and he received the endorsement of the master. But the man who went softly by circuitous ways, peering with caution, seeking after secrecy, that was the man who received no suspension of judgment from White Fang, and who went away abruptly, hurriedly, and without dignity. Weedon Scott had set himself the task of redeeming White Fang, or rather, of redeeming mankind from the wrong it had done to White Fang. It was a matter of principle and conscience. He felt that the ill-done White Fang was a debt incurred by man, and that it must be paid. So he went out of his way to be especially kind to the fighting wolf. Each day he made it a point to caress and pet White Fang, and to do it at length. At first suspicious and hostile, White Fang grew to like this petting. But there was one thing that he never outgrew: his growling. Growl he would, from the moment the petting began till it ended, but it was a growl with a new note in it. He was purring. He's a fucking cat. He's goddamn purring. A stranger could not hear this note, and to such a stranger the growling of White Fang was an exhibition of primordial savagery, nerve-wracking and blood-curdling. But White Fang's throat had become harsh-fibered from the making of ferocious sounds through the many years of his first little rasp of anger in the lair of his cubhood, and he could not soften the sounds of that throat now to express the gentleness he felt. Nevertheless, Weedon Scott's ear and sympathy were fine enough to catch the new note, all but drowned in its fierceness. The note that was the faintest hint of a croon of content, and that none but he could hear. As the days went by, the evolution of like into love was accelerated. White Fang himself began to grow aware of it, though in his consciousness he knew not what love was. It manifested itself to him as a void in his being, a hungry, aching, yearning void that clamored to be filled. It was a pain and an unrest. It received easement only by the touch of the new god's presence. At such times, love was joy to him, a wild, keen, thrilling satisfaction. But when away from his god, the pain and the unrest returned. The void in him sprang up and pressed against him with his emptiness, and the hunger gnawed and gnawed unceasingly. So, love, the double-edged sword, I guess. Edged up. White Fang was in the process of finding himself. In spite of the maturity of his years and of the savage rigidity of the mold that had formed him, his nature was undergoing an expansion. There was a burgeoning within him of strange feelings and unwanted impulses. His old code of conduct was changing. In the past, he had liked comfort and surcease from pain, disliked discomfort and pain, and he had adjusted his actions accordingly. But now it was different. Because of this new feeling within him, he oftentimes elected discomfort and pain for the sake of his god. Thus, in the early morning, instead of roaming and foraging or lying in a sheltered nook, he would wait for hours on the cheerless cabin stoop for a sight of the god's face. At night, when the god returned home, White Fang would leave the warm sleeping place he had burrowed in the snow in order to receive the friendly snap of fingers and the word of greeting. Meat. Even meat itself he would forego to be with his god, to receive a caress from him, or to accompany him down into the town. Like had been replaced by love. And love was the plummet dropped down into the deeps of him where like had never gone. And responsive out of his deeps had come the new thing, love. That which was given unto him he did return. This was a god indeed, a love god, a warm and radiant god in whose light White Fang's nature expanded as a flower expands under the sun. This is literally very flowery language. But White Fang was not demonstrative. He was too old, too firmly molded to become adept at expressing himself in new ways. He was too self-possessed, too strongly poised in his own isolation. Too long had he cultivated reticence, aloofness, and moroseness. He had never barked in all his life. He could not now learn to bark a welcome when his god approached. He was never in the way, never extravagant nor foolish in the expression of his love. He never ran to meet his god. He waited at a distance, but he always waited, was always there. His love partook of the nature of worship, dumb, inarticulate, a silent adoration. Only by the steady regard of his eyes did he express his love, and by the unceasing following with his eyes of his god's every movement. Also, at times, when his god looked at him and spoke to him, he betrayed an awkward self-consciousness, caused by the struggle of his love to express itself and his physical inability to express it. He learned to adjust himself in many ways to his new life, to his new mode of life. It was borne in upon him that he must let his master's dogs alone. Yet his dominant nature asserted itself, and he had first to thrash them into an acknowledgement of his superiority and leadership. This accomplished, he had little trouble with them. They gave trail to him when he came and went or walked among them, and when he asserted his will, they obeyed. In the same way, he came to tolerate Matt as a possession of his master. His master rarely fed him. Matt did that. It was his business. Yet White Fang divined that it was his master's food he ate, and that it was his master who thus fed him vicariously. Matt it was who tried to put him into the harness and make him haul sled with the other dogs, but Matt failed. It was not until Weedon Scott put the harness on White Fang and worked him that he understood. He took it as his master's will that Matt should drive him and work him just as he drove and worked his master's other dogs. He's a smart wolf. He's a smart wolf, yes. Different from the Mackenzie toboggans were the Klondike sleds with runners under them. And different was the method of driving the dogs. Different from the Mackenzie toboggans were the Klondike sleds with runners under them. Right. And different was the method of driving the dogs. There was no fan formation of the team. The dogs worked in single file, one behind another, hauling on double traces, and here in the Klondike, the leader was indeed the leader. The wisest, as well as the strongest dog was the leader. Then the team obeyed him and feared him. That White Fang should quickly gain this post was inevitable. He could not be satisfied with less, as Matt learned after much inconvenience and trouble. White Fang picked out the post for himself, and Matt backed his judgment with strong language after the experiment had been tried. But though he worked in the sled in the day, White Fang did not forego the guarding of his master's property in the night. Thus he was on duty all the time, ever vigilant and faithful, the most valuable of all the dogs. "Making free to spit out what's in me," Matt said one day. I beg to state that you was a wise guy, all right, when you paid the price you did for that dog. You clean swindled Beauty Smith on top of pushing his face in with your fist." A well-deserved pushing of the face in with said fist. A recrudescence of anger glinted in Weedon Scott's gray eyes, and he muttered savagely, "The beast." In the late spring, a great trouble came to White Fang. Without warning, the Love Master disappeared. I got a speckle of something in my glasses. It's been this little blurry white dot in the corner of my eyes this entire night. Finally bothered me. Oh, let's see. Scott's disappeared again. There had been warning, but White Fang was unversed in such things and did not understand the packing of a grip. He remembered afterwards that his packing had preceded the master's disappearance, but at the time he suspected nothing. That night he waited for the master to return. At midnight, the chill wind that blew drove him to shelter at the rear of the cabin. There he drowsed, only half asleep, his ears keyed for the first sound of the familiar step. But at 2 a.m, his anxiety drove him out to the cold front stoop, where he crouched and waited. But no master came. In the morning, the door opened and Matt stepped outside. White Fang gazed at him wistfully. There was no common speech by which he might learn what he wanted to know. The days came and went, but never the master. White Fang, who had never known sickness in his life, became sick. He became very sick, and so sick that Matt was finally compelled to bring him inside the cabin. Also, in writing to his employer, Matt devoted a postscript to White Fang. Weedon Scott, reading the letter down in Circle City, came upon the following. "That damn wolf won't work, won't eat, ain't got no spunk left, all the dogs is licking him." All the dogs is licking him, oh, they care, that's nice. "Wants to know what has become of you, and I don't know how to tell him. Maybe he is going to die." It was as Matt had said. White Fang had ceased eating, lost heart, and allowed every dog of the team to thrash him. So not actually lick him, but okay, wow, that's not nearly as nice as I was imagining. In the cabin, he lay on the floor near the stove, without interest in food, in Matt, nor in life. Matt might talk gently to him or swear at him, it was all the same. He never did more than turn his dull eyes upon the man, then drop his head back into its customary position on his forepaws. And then one night, Matt, reading to himself with moving lips and mumbled sounds, was startled by a low whine from White Fang. He had got upon his feet, his ears cocked towards the door, and he was listening intently. A moment later, Matt heard a footstep. The door opened, and Weedon Scott stepped in. The two men shook hands, then Scott looked around the room. "Where's the wolf?" he asked. And he discovered him, standing where he had been laying, near to the stove. He had not rushed forward after the manner of other dogs. He stood, watching and waiting. "Holy smoke," Matt exclaimed. "Look at him wag his tail." Weedon Scott strode half across the room toward him, at the same time calling him. White Fang came to him, not with a great bound, yet quickly. He was awakened from self-consciousness, but as he drew near, his eyes took on a strange expression. Something, an incommunicable vastness of feeling rose up into his eyes as a light and shone forth. "He never looked at me that way all the time you was gone," Matt commented. Weedon Scott did not hear. He was squatting down on his heels, face to face with White Fang and petting him, rubbing at the roots of his ears, making long caressing strokes down the neck to the shoulders, tapping the spine gently with the balls of his fingers. And White Fang was growling responsively, and crooned the crooning note of the growl more pronounced than ever. But that was not all. What of his joy? The great love in him, ever surging and struggling to express itself, succeeded in finding a new mode of expression. He suddenly thrust his head forward and nudged his way in between the master's arm and body. And here, confined, hidden from view all except his ears, no longer growling, he continued to nudge and snuggle. The two men looked at each other. Scott's eyes were shining. "Gosh," said Matt in an awe-stricken voice. A moment later, when he had recovered himself, he said, "I always insisted that the wolf was a dog. Look at him." With the return of the Love Master, I wish I had chosen a different name. That label probably not aging as well as it could. Not nearly as bad as some others, but yes. With the return of the Love Master, White Fang's recovery was rapid. 2 nights and a day he spent in the cabin, then he sallied forth. The sled dogs had forgotten his prowess. They remembered only the latest, which was his weakness and sickness. At the sight of him, as he came out of the cabin, they sprang upon him. "Talk about your roughhouses," Matt murmured gleefully, standing in the doorway and looking on. "Give 'em hell, you wolf. Give 'em hell and then some." White Fang did not need the encouragement. The return of the Love Master was enough. Life was flowing through him, splendid and indomitable. He fought from sheer joy, finding in it an expression of much that he felt that otherwise was without speech. There could be but one ending. The team dispersed in ignominious defeat, and it was not until after dark that the dogs came sneaking back one, by meekness and humility, signifying their fealty to White Fang. At least they're not biting out each other's throats now. That's kind of nice. We are going to take a little break. We have ads creeping up on us. We'll get through those and we'll be right back. Okay, and we are back. Let's see, where are we? Alright, the other dogs have come back to swear fealty to White Fang. He is the boss. I need a little bit of air. Having learned to snuggle, White Fang was guilty of it often. It was the final word. He could not go beyond it. The one thing of which he had always been particularly jealous was his head. He had always disliked to have it touched. It was the wild in him, the fear of hurt and of the trap, that had given rise to the panicky impulses to avoid contact. It was the mandate of this instinct that the head must be free. And now, with the Love Master, his snuggling was the deliberate act of putting himself into a position of hopeless helplessness. It was an expression of perfect confidence, of absolute self-surrender, as though he said, "I put myself into thy hands. Work thy will with me." Yeah, or we could just call it, hey, he's learned to trust this guy. That's way actually cooler than the implications of that particular phrase, for fuck's sakes. One night, not long after the return, Scott and Matt sat at a game of cribbage preliminary to going to bed. 15-2, 15-4, and a pair makes 6. Matt was pegging up when there was an outcry and sound of snarling without. He obviously found religion. Yeah, that's definitely how they're coding it, right? They looked at each other as they started to rise to their feet. The wolves nailed somebody, Matt said. A wild scream of fear and anguish hastened them. Bring a light, Scott shouted as he sprang outside. Matt followed with the lamp, and by its light they saw a man lying on his back in the snow. His arms were folded, one above the other, across his face and throat. Thus he was trying to shield himself from White Fang's teeth. And there was need for it. White Fang was in a rage, wickedly making his attack on the most vulnerable spot. From shoulder to wrist of the crossed arms, the coat sleeves, the blue flannel shirt and undershirt were ripped in rags, while the arms themselves were terribly slashed and streaming blood. I bet you this is the other guy, right? This is the previous owner. What's his face? Beauty? All this the two men saw in the first instant. The next instant, Weedon Scott had White Fang by the throat and was dragging him clear. White Fang struggled and snarled, but made no attempt to bite, while he quickly quieted down at a sharp word from the master. Yeah, I can see dogs, reacting like that. Oh, look, this guy hurt me a lot, and he's no longer the person I have to obey. Time to eat. I guess we'll find out. Matt helped the man to his feet. As he arose, he lowered his crossed arms, exposing, here we go, the bestial face of Beauty Smith. The dog musher let go of him precipitately, with actions similar to that of a man who has picked up a live fire. Beauty Smith blinked in the lamplight and looked about him. He caught sight of White Fang, and terror rushed into his face. At the same moment, Matt noticed two objects lying in the snow. He held the lamp close to them, indicating them with his toe for his employer's benefit. A steel dog chain with a stout club. Weedon Scott saw and nodded. Not a word was spoken. The dog musher laid his hand on Beauty Smith's shoulder and faced him to the right about. No word needed to be spoken. Beauty Smith started. In the meantime, the love master was patting White Fang and talking to him. Tried to steal you, eh? And you wouldn't have it. Well, well, he made a mistake, didn't he? Must have thought he had hold of 17 devils, the dog musher sniggered. White Fang, still wrought up and bristling, growled and growled, the hair slowly lying down, the crooning note, remote and dim, but growing in his throat. Let's see. That was the end of part 4. We have one more part, that being part 5. And we have 2 hours to go. Okay, it'd be interesting to see how far we get. If we don't finish tonight, it'll be a very short conclusion next Monday. Then we'll pick up with Carmilla after that. Part 5, Chapter 1, The Long Trail. It was in the air. White Fang sensed the coming calamity even before there was tangible evidence of it. In vague ways it was borne in upon him that a change was impending. He knew not how nor why, yet he got his feel of the oncoming event from the gods themselves. In ways subtler than they knew, they betrayed their intentions to the wolf dog that haunted the cabin stoop, and that, though he never came inside the cabin, knew what went on inside their brains. Listen to that, will you? The dog musher exclaimed at supper one night. Weedon Scott listened. Through the door came a low, anxious whine, like a sobbing under the breath that had just grown audible. Then came the long sniff, as White Fang reassured himself that his god was still inside and had not yet taken himself off in mysterious and solitary flight. I do believe that wolf's on to you, the dog musher said. Weedon Scott looked across at his companion with eyes that almost pleaded, though this was given the lie by his words. What the devil can I do with a wolf in California? He demanded. That's what I say, Matt answered. What the devil can you do with a wolf in California? Wait, sorry, let me rephrase that. What the devil can you do? As in, what are you going to do with the devil in California? But this did not satisfy Whedon Scott. The others seemed to be judging him in a non-committal sort of way. White man's dog should have no show against him, Scott went on. He'd kill them on sight. If he didn't bankrupt me with damage suits, the authorities would take him away from me and electrocute him. That's horrific. By the way, if you didn't know, electrocution is an insanely torturous way to kill some people. Well, any people, all people. Don't kill people. Yes. Definitely not with electricity. He's a downright murderer, I know, was the dog musher's comment. Whedon Scott looked at him suspiciously. It would never do, he said decisively. It would never do, Matt concurred. Why, you'd have to hire a man specially to take care of him. The other's suspicion was allayed. He nodded cheerfully. In the silence that followed, the low, half-sobbing whine was heard at the door, and then the long, questing sniff. There's no denying he thinks a hell of a lot of you, Matt said. The other glared at him in sudden wrath. Damn it all, man. I know my own mind and what's best. I'm agreeing with you, only... Only what? Scott snapped. Only... The dog musher began softly, then changed his mind and betrayed a rising anger of his own. Well, you needn't get so all fired het about it. Judging by your actions, one would think you didn't know your own mind. Whedon Scott debated with himself for a while and then said, more gently, You're right, Matt. I don't know my own mind. That's what's the trouble. Why, it would be rank ridiculousness for me to take that dog along, he broke out after another pause. I'm agreeing with you, was Matt's answer, and again his employer was not quite satisfied with him. But how in the name of Sardanopolis he knows you're going is what gets me, the dog musher continued innocently. It's beyond me, Matt, Scott answered with a mournful shake of the head. He's a smart doggo, that's why. He's a good pupper. Then came the day when, through the open cabin door, White Fang saw the fatal grip on the floor and the love master packing things into it. Also, there were comings and goings, and the erstwhile placid atmosphere of the cabin was vexed with strange perturbations and unrest. Here was indubitable evidence. White Fang had already scented it. Now he reasoned it. His god was preparing for another flight, and since he had not taken him with him before, so now he could look to be left behind. That night, he lifted the long wolf howl, as he had howled in his puppy days, when he fled back from the wild to the village to find it vanished and naught but a rubbish heap, to mark the site of Grey Beaver's teepee. Now he pointed his muzzle to the cold stars and told to them his woe. Inside the cabin, the two men had just gone to bed. And now he's going to get his vengeance upon you by not letting you sleep. He's gone off his food again, Matt remarked from his bunk. There was a grunt from Whedon Scott's bunk, and a stir of blankets. From the way he cut up the other time you went away, I wouldn't wonder this time but what he died. I wouldn't wonder this time but what he died. Oh, your words are just so wrong. The blankets in the other bunk stirred irritably. Oh, shut up, Scott cried through the darkness. You nag worse than a woman. I'm agreeing with you, the dog musher answered, and Whedon Scott was not quite sure whether or not the other had snickered. The next day, White Fang's anxiety and restlessness were even more pronounced. He dogged his master's heels whenever he left the cabin, and haunted the front stoop when he remained inside. Through the open door he could catch glimpses of the luggage on the floor. The grip had been joined by two large canvas bags and a box. Matt was rolling the master's blankets and fur robe inside a small tarpaulin. White Fang whined as he watched the operation. Later on, two natives arrived. He watched them closely as they shouldered the luggage and were led off down the hill by Matt, who carried the bedding and the grip. But White Fang did not follow them. The master was still in the cabin. After a time, Matt returned. The master came to the door and called White Fang inside. "You poor devil," he said gently, rubbing White Fang's ears and tapping his spine. "I'm hitting the long trail, old man, where you cannot follow. Now give me a growl, the last goodbye growl." But White Fang refused to growl. Instead, and after a wistful searching look, he snuggled in, burrowing his head out of sight between his master's arm and body. "There she blows," Matt cried. From the Yukon arose the hoarse bellowing of a river steamboat. "You've got to cut it short. Be sure and lock the front door. I'll go out the back. Get a move on." The two doors slammed at the same time, and Weed and Scott waited for Matt to come around to the front. From inside the door came a low whining and sobbing. Then there were long, deep-drawn sniffs. "You must take good care of him, Matt," Scott said as they started down the hill. "Write and let me know how he gets along." "Sure," the dog musher answered. "But listen to that, will you?" Both men stopped. White Fang was howling as dogs howl when their masters lie dead. He was voicing in utter woe, his cry bursting upward in great heart-breaking rushes, dying down into quavering misery, and bursting upward again with a rush upon rush of grief. I've got a kitty cat. When I look at the kitty cat, she meows. Every single time, and I'm doing that with my head.
Hi. What you doing? Are you gonna howl if I go pet you?
Okay. The Aurora was the first steamboat of the year for the outside, and her decks were jammed with prosperous adventurers and broken gold seekers, all equally as mad to get to the outside as they had been originally to get to the inside. Near the gangplank, Scott was shaking hands with Matt, who was preparing to go ashore, but Matt's hand went limp in the other's grasp as his gaze shot past to remain fixed on something behind him. Oh no. Scott turned to see. Sitting on the deck several feet away and watching wistfully was White Fang. It's like when we had trouble with the kitty cats who were absolutely just going to get into cupboards no matter what. And Gwen, what are you doing, baby?
Enjoying the fan? Yeah.
She's sitting behind my monitor. The dog musher swore softly in awe-stricken accents. Scott could only look and wonder. "Did you lock the front door?" Matt demanded. The other nodded and asked, "How about the back?" "You just bet I did," was the fervent reply. White Fang flattened his ears ingratiatingly, but remained where he was, making no attempt to approach. "I'll have to take him ashore with me." Matt made a couple of steps toward White Fang, but the latter slid away from him. The dog musher made a rush of it, and White Fang dodged between the legs of a group of men, ducking, turning, doubling. He slid about the deck, eluding the other's efforts to capture him. Yeah, I'm getting stared at by Gwen as I read. Matt made a couple of steps toward White Fang, but I read that already. But when the Love Master spoke, White Fang came to him with prompt obedience. Won't come to the hand that's fed him all these months," the dog musher muttered resentfully. "And you ain't never fed him after them first days of getting acquainted. I am blamed if I can see how he works it out that you're the boss." Scott, who had been patting White Fang, suddenly bent closer and pointed out fresh-made cuts on his muzzle and a gash between the eyes. Matt bent over and passed his hand along White Fang's belly. We plumb forgot the window. He's all cut and gouged underneath. Must have butted clean through it. Bagosh. But Weedon Scott was not listening. He was thinking rapidly. The Aurora's whistle hooted a final announcement of departure. Men were scurrying down the gangplank to the shore. Matt loosened the bandana from his own neck and started to put it around White Fang's. Scott grasped the dog musher's hand. Goodbye, Matt, old man. About the wolf, you needn't write. You see, I've... What? The dog musher exploded. You don't mean to say. The very thing I mean. Here's your bandana. I'll write to you about him. Matt paused halfway down the gangplank. He'll never stand the climate, he shouted back, unless you clip him in warm weather. The gangplank was hauled in, and the Aurora swung out from the bank. Weedon Scott waved a last goodbye, then he turned and bent over White Fang, standing by his side. Now growl, damn you, growl, he said, as he patted the responsive head and rubbed the flattening ears. Chapter 2, The Southland. White Fang landed from the steamer in San Francisco. He was appalled. Deep in him, below any reasoning process or active consciousness, he had associated power with godhead. And never had the white men seemed such marvelous gods as now. When he trod the slimy pavement of San Francisco, the log cabins he had known were replaced by towering buildings. The streets were crowded with perils. Wagons, carts, automobiles, great, straining horses pulling huge trucks, and monstrous cable and electric cars hooting and clanging through the midst, screeching their insistent menace after the manner of the lynxes he had known in the northern woods. All this was the manifestation of power. Through it all, behind it all, was man, governing and controlling, expressing himself as of old by his mastery over matter. It was colossal, stunning. White Fang was awed. Fear sat upon him. And you probably heard that meow. That was a crazy loud meow. As in his cubhood, he had been made to feel his smallness and puniness on the day he first came in from the wild to the village of Grey Beaver. So now, in his full-grown stature and pride of strength, he was made to feel small and puny. And there were so many gods. He was made dizzy by the swarming of them. The thunder of the streets smote upon his ears. He was bewildered by the tremendous and endless rush of movement of things. As never before, he felt his dependence on the Love Master, close at whose heels he followed, no matter what happened, never losing sight of him. But White Fang was to have no more than a nightmare vision of the city, an experience that was like a bad dream, unreal and terrible, that haunted him for long after his dreams. He was put into a baggage car by the master, chained in a corner in the midst of heaped trunks and valises. And valises, whatever the hell that is. Here a squat and brawny god held sway, with much noise, hurling trunks and boxes about, dragging them in through the door and tossing them into the piles, or flinging them out of the door, smashing and crashing to other gods who waited with them. Probably, that's it. Valises. Valises. And here, in this inferno of luggage, was White Fang deserted by the master. Or at least, White Fang thought he was deserted, until he smelled out the master's canvas clothes bags alongside of him, and proceeded to mount guard over them. I could just keep protecting stuff. French is French. It is French. Okay, great, but it's still not a word I know.
I still have a Gwen. Oh, you brought a toy. Oh, you're so cute. You're so damn cute. You know that? Come on, I have to throw them all. Okay. Ready? Last one. Last one. Just went over it.
It hit the door and both door frames and came back inside. It doesn't count.
Ready? Ready?
And off she goes. That's all she wants, is just to be able to run.
Good girl, you brought it back. Ready?
If you tell her it's the last one, she is much more likely to bring it back to you. And sometimes she'll just bring it back to you. Oh, good girl. Good girl. Yeah. Hi. Hey. Bless you. Bless you. Bless you. Bless you. Bless you. I have kitty mucus on my face now. Yeah. Thank you so much for that. Did my beard make you sneeze? Yeah. You want to read with me? Where are we? Oh yes, he proceeded to mount guard over them. No, okay, the second I started reading, she's like, nope, I want out of your arms. I'm going to go stand by the toy. About time you come, growled the god of the car an hour later, when Weedon Scott appeared at the door. That dog of yourn won't let me lay a finger on your stuff. White Fang emerged from the car. He was astonished. The nightmare city was gone. The car had been to him no more than a room in a house, and when he had entered it, the city had been all around him. In the interval, the city had disappeared. The roar of it no longer dinned upon his ears. Before him was smiling country, streaming with sunshine, lazy with quietude. But he had little time to marvel at the transformation. He accepted it, as he accepted all the unaccountable doings and manifestations of the gods. It was their way. There was a carriage waiting. A man and a woman approached the master. The woman's arms went out and clutched the master around the neck, a hostile act. The next moment, Weedon Scott had torn loose from the embrace and closed with White Fang, who had become a snarling, raging demon. It's all right, Mother, Scott was saying as he kept tight hold of White Fang and placated him. He thought you were going to injure me. He wouldn't stand for it. He wouldn't stand for it. It's all right. It's all right. He'll learn soon enough. And in the meantime, I may be permitted to love my son when his dog is not around, she laughed, though she was pale and weak from the fright. She looked at White Fang, who snarled and bristled and glared malevolently. He'll have to learn, and he shall, without postponement, Scott said. He spoke softly to White Fang until he had quieted him, and his voice became firm. Down, sir, down with you. This had been one of the things taught him by the master, and White Fang obeyed, though he lay down reluctantly and sullenly. Now, Mother? Scott opened his arms to her, but kept his eyes on White Fang. Down, he warned. Down. White Fang, bristling silently, half crouching as he rose, sank back and watched the hostile act repeated. But no harm came of it, nor of the embrace from the strange man-god that followed. Then the clothes bags were taken into the carriage, the strange gods and the love master followed, and White Fang pursued, now running vigilantly behind, now bristling up to the running horses and warning them that he was there to see no harm befell the god they dragged so swiftly across the earth. At the end of 15 minutes, the carriage swung in through a stone gateway and on between a double row of arched and interlacing walnut trees. On either side stretched lawns, their broad sweep broken here and there by great sturdy-limbed oaks. In the near distance, in contrast with the young green of the tended grass, sunburnt hayfields showed tan and gold, while beyond were the tawny hills and upland pastures. From the head of the lawn, on the first soft swell from the valley level, looked down the deep porched, many-windowed houses. I hope I read that right. I think my brain turned off while I was doing it. Little opportunity was given White Fang to see all this. Hardly had the carriage entered the grounds when he was set upon by a sheepdog, bright-eyed, sharp-muzzled, righteously indignant and angry. It was between him and the master, cutting him off. White Fang snarled, no warning, but his hair bristled and he made his silent and deadly rush. This rush was never completed. He halted with awkward abruptness, with stiff forelegs bracing himself against his momentum, almost sitting down on his haunches. So desirous was he of avoiding contact with the dog, he was in the act of attacking. It was a female, and the law of his kind thrust a barrier between. For him to attack her would require nothing less than a violation of his instinct, which, he's been doing a good job of violating whenever he needs to. But with the sheepdog, it was otherwise. Being a female, she possessed no such instinct. On the other hand, being a sheepdog, her instinctive fear of the wild, and especially of the wolf, was unusually keen. White Fang was to her a wolf, the hereditary marauder who had preyed upon her flocks from the time sheep were first herded and guarded by some dim ancestor of hers. And so, as he abandoned his rush at her and braced himself to avoid the contact, she sprang upon him. He snarled involuntarily as he felt her teeth in his shoulder, but beyond this made no offer to hurt her. He backed away, stiff-legged and with self-conscious, and tried to go around her. He dodged this way and that, and curved and turned, but to no purpose. She remained always between him and the way he wanted to go. "Here, collie," called the strange man in the carriage. Weedon Scott laughed. "Never mind, father. It's a good discipline. White Fang will have to learn many things, and it's just as well that he begins now. He'll adjust himself all right." Yeah, one or two minor infections along the way. The carriage drove on, and still Collie blocked White Fang's way. He tried to outrun her by leaving the drive and circling across the lawn, but she ran on the inner and smaller circle, and was always there, facing him with her 2 rows of gleaming teeth. Back he circled, across the drive to the other lawn, and again she headed him off. The carriage was bearing the master away. White Fang caught glimpses of it disappearing amongst the trees. The situation was desperate. He essayed another circle. She followed, running swiftly, and then suddenly he turned upon her. It was his old fighting trick. Shoulder to shoulder, he struck her squarely. Not only was she overthrown, so fast had she been running that she rolled along, now on her back, now on her side, as she struggled to stop, clawing gravel with her feet and crying shrilly her hurt pride and indignation. White Fang did not wait. The way was clear, and that was all he had wanted. She took after him, never ceasing her outcry. It was the straightaway now, and when it came to real running, White Fang could teach her things. She ran frantically, hysterically, straining to the utmost, advertising the effort she was making with every leap. And all the time, White Fang slid smoothly away from her silently, without effort, gliding like a ghost over the ground. As he rounded the house to the porte-cochere, whatever, French word, he came upon the carriage. It had stopped, and the master was alighting. At this moment, still running at top speed, White Fang became suddenly aware of an attack from the side. It was a deer hound rushing upon him. White Fang tried to face it, but he was going too fast and the hound was too close. It struck him on the side, and such was his forward momentum and the unexpectedness of it, White Fang was hurled to the ground and rolled clear over. He came out of the tangle, a spectacle of malignancy, ears flattened back, lips writhing, nose wrinkling, his teeth clipping together as the fangs barely missed the hound's soft throat. Y'all need to, maybe control your dogs. All 3 of these animals need to be introduced to one another, not just let go. Crazy. Especially, Scott knows the history and demeanor within Yeah, this is not doing intros. And White Fang has a history of the Scots pretty much aware this is an abused animal, and it's going to have a lot of issues. It now has a dependency upon Scott, and Scott's kind of not respecting that. The master was running up, but was too far away, and it was Collie that saved the hound's life. Before White Fang could spring in and deliver the fatal stroke, and just as he was in the act of springing in, Collie arrived. She had been outmaneuvered and outrun, but to say nothing of her having been unceremoniously tumbled in the gravel, and her arrival was like that of a tornado. Made up of offended dignity, justifiable wrath, and instinctive hatred for this marauder from the wild, she struck White Fang at right angles in the midst of his spring, and again he was knocked off his feet and rolled over. The next moment the master arrived. With one hand he held White Fang while the father called off the dogs. "I say, this is a pretty warm reception for a poor lone wolf from the Arctic," the master said, while White Fang calmed down under his caressing hand. "In all his life, he's only been known once to go off his feet, and here he's been rolled twice in 30 seconds. Yeah, maybe look after him. He's going to be very fucking angry." The carriage had driven away, and the other strange gods had appeared from out of the house. Some of these stood respectfully at a distance, but two of them, women, perpetrated the hostile act of clutching the master around the neck. White Fang, however, was beginning to tolerate this act. No harm seemed to come of it, while the noises the gods made were certainly not threatening. These gods also made overtures to White Fang, but he warned them off with a snarl, and the master did likewise with word of mouth. At such times, White Fang leaned in close to the master's legs and received reassuring pats on the head. The hound under the command, "Dick, lie down, sir," had gone up the steps and lain down on one side of the porch, still growling and keeping a sullen watch on the intruder. Collie had been taken in charge by one of the women gods, who held arms around her neck and petted and caressed her. But Collie was very much perplexed and worried, whining and restless, outraged by the permitted presence of this wolf, and confident that the gods were making a mistake. Arrogant Collie. All the gods started up the steps to enter the house. White Fang followed closely at the master's heels. Dick on the porch growled, and White Fang on the steps bristled and growled back. "Take Holly inside and leave the two of them to fight it out," suggested Scott's father. "After that, they'll be friends." Yeah, that's the man who doesn't know what he's talking about. But to be fair, he doesn't know what he's talking about for reasons. "Then White Fang, to show his friendship, will have to be chief mourner at the funeral," laughed the master. The elder Scott looked incredulously first at White Fang, then at Dick, and finally at his son. "You mean?" Whedon nodded his head. "I mean just that. You'd have a dead Dick inside 1 minute, 2 minutes at the farthest." He turned to White Fang. "Come on, you wolf. It's you that'll have to come inside." White Fang walked stiff-legged up the steps and across the porch, with tail rigidly erect, keeping his eyes on Dick to guard against a flank attack, and at the same time prepared for whatever fierce manifestation of the unknown that might pounce out upon him from the interior of the house. But no thing of fear pounced out, and when he had gained the inside, he scouted carefully around, looking at it and finding it not. Then he lay down with a contented grunt at the master's feet, observing all that went on. Ever ready to spring to his feet and fight for life with the terrors he felt must lurk under the trap roof of the dwelling. Chapter 3. The God's Domain. Not only was White Fang adaptable by nature, but he had traveled much. and knew the meaning and necessity of adjustment. Here in Sierra Vista, so this is where we start at the beginning of the stream by mistake, which was the name of Judge Scott's place, White Fang quickly began to make himself at home. He had no further serious trouble with the dogs. They knew more about the ways of the Southland gods than did he, and in their eyes he qualified when he accompanied the gods inside the house. Wolf that he was, and unprecedented as it was, the gods had sanctioned his presence, and they, the dogs of the gods, could only recognize this sanction. Dick, perforce, had to go through a few stiff formalities at first, after which he calmly accepted White Fang as an addition to the premises. Had Dick had his way, they would have been good friends, but White Fang was averse to friendship. All he asked of the other dogs was to be left alone. His whole life he had kept aloof from his kind, and he still desired to keep aloof. Dick's overtures bothered him, so he snarled Dick away. In the north he had learned the lesson that he must let master's dogs alone, and he did not forget that lesson now. But he insisted on his own privacy and self-seclusion, and so thoroughly ignored Dick that the good-natured creature finally gave him up and scarcely took as much interest in him as in the hitching post near the stable. Not so with Collie. While she accepted him because it was the mandate of the gods, that was no reason that she should leave him in peace. Woven into her being was the memory of countless crimes he and his had perpetrated against her ancestry. Not in a day nor a generation were the ravaged sheepfolds to be forgotten. All this was a spur to her, prickling her to retaliation. She could not fly in the face of the gods who permitted him, but that did not prevent her from making life miserable for him in petty ways. A feud, ages old, was between them, and she, for one, would see to it that he was reminded. So Collie took advantage of her sex to pick upon White Fang and maltreat him. His instinct would not permit him to attack her, while her persistence would not permit him to ignore her. When she rushed at him, he turned his fur-protected shoulder to her sharp teeth and walked away stiff-legged and stately. When she forced him too hard, he was compelled to go about in a circle, his shoulder presented to her, his head turned from her, and on his face and in his eyes a patient and bored expression. Sometimes, however, a nip on his hindquarters hastened his retreat and made it anything but stately. But as a rule, he managed to maintain a dignity that was almost solemn. He ignored her existence whenever it was possible and made it a point to keep out of her way. When he saw or heard her coming, he got up and walked off. So he gave her trail, I guess. There was much in other matters for White Fang to learn. Life in the Northland was simplicity itself when compared to the complicated affairs of Sierra Vista. First of all, he had to learn the family of the master. In a way, he was prepared to do this. As Mitsa and Klukuch had belonged to Grey Beaver, sharing his food, his fire, and his blankets, so now at Sierra Vista belonged to the Love Master all the denizens of the house. But in this matter there was a difference, and many differences. Sierra Vista was a far vaster affair than the teepee of Grey Beaver. There were many persons to be considered. There was Judge Scott, and there was his wife. There were the master's two sisters, Beth and Mary. There was his wife, Alice, and then there were his children, Whedon and Maud, toddlers of 4 and 6. There was no way for anybody to tell him about all these people, and of the blood ties and relationship he knew nothing whatever and never would be capable of knowing. Yet he quickly worked out that all of them belonged to the master. Then, by observation, whenever opportunity offered, and by study of action, speech, and the very intonations of the voice, he slowly learned the intimacy and the degree of favor they enjoyed with the master. And by this a certain standard, White Fang treated them accordingly. What was of value to the master, he valued. What was dear to the master was to be cherished by White Fang and guarded carefully. Thus it was with the two children. All his life he had disliked children. He hated and feared their hands. The lessons were not tender that he had learned of their tyranny and cruelty in the days of the native villages. When Whedon and Maud had first approached him, he growled warningly and looked malignant. A cuff from the master and a sharp word had then compelled him to permit their caresses, though he growled and growled under their tiny hands, and in the growl there was no crooning note. Later he observed that the boy and girl were of great value in the master's eyes. Then it was that no cuff nor sharp word was necessary before they could pat him. Yet White Fang was never effusively affectionate. He yielded to the master's children with an ill but honest grace, and endured their fooling as one would endure a painful operation. I wouldn't endure a painful operation, to be perfectly honest. When he could no longer endure, he would get up and stalk determinedly away from them. But after a time, he grew even to like the children. Still, he was not demonstrative. He would not go up to them. On the other hand, instead of walking away at sight of them, he waited for them to come to him. And still later it was noticed that a pleasing light came into his eyes when he saw them approaching, and that he looked after them with an appearance of curious regret when they left him for other amusements. All this was a matter of development and took time. Next in his regard after the children was Judge Scott. There were two reasons, possibly, for this. First, he was evidently a valuable possession of the master's, and next, he was undemonstrative. White Fang liked to lie at his feet on the wide porch when he read the newspaper, from time to time favoring White Fang with a look or a word, untroublesome tokens that he recognized White Fang's presence and existence. But this was only when the master was not around. When the master appeared, all other beings ceased to exist so far as White Fang was concerned. Understandable. White Fang allowed all the members of the family to pet him and make much of him. But he could never give to them he never gave to them what he gave to the master. No caress of theirs could put the love croon into his throat, and, try as they would, they could never persuade him into snuggling against them. The judge is the spare human. I don't know about that. He's just the nice human who doesn't bother him too much, I think, is kind of what's going on there. Oh crap, where was I? White Fang concerned. White Fang allowed the members of the family to pet him and make much of him, but he could never give them, no caress of theirs to put the love croon in, and try as they would, they could never persuade him into snuggling against him. Yeah, snuggling. This expression of abandon and surrender of absolute trust he reserved for the master alone. In fact, he never regarded the members of the family in any other light than possessions of the love master. Also, White Fang had early come to differentiate between the family and the servants of the household. The latter were afraid of him, while he merely refrained from attacking them. Okay, all right. They're master's servants. I guess I won't eat them. This because he considered that they were likewise possessions of the master. Between White Fang and them existed a neutrality and no more. They cooked for the master and washed the dishes and did other things, just as Matt had done up in the Klondike. They were, in short, appurtenances of the household. Appurtenances. That's another one of them words. It's a word. Probably. It was used in a book. Outside the household, there was even more for White Fang to learn. The master's domain was wide and complex, yet it had its metes and bounds. The land itself ceased at the country road. Outside was the common domain of all gods, the roads and streets. Then, inside, other fences were the particular domains of other gods. A myriad laws governed all these things and determined conduct. Yet he did not know the speech of the gods, nor was there any way for him to learn save by experience. He obeyed his natural impulses until they ran him counter to some law. When this had been done a few times, he learned the law, and after that observed it. But most potent in his education was the cuff of the master's hand, the censure of the master's voice. Because of White Fang's very great love, a cuff from the master hurt him far more than any beating Grey Beaver or Beauty Smith had ever given him. They had hurt only the flesh of him. Beneath the flesh, the spirit had still raged, splendid and invincible. But with the master, the cuff was always too light to hurt the flesh. Yet it went deeper. It was an expression of the master's disapproval, and while White Fang's spirit wilted under it. A few times tonight, I've read white, and my brain has said while. There's one letter difference. I want a new font. In point of fact, the cuff was rarely administered. The master's voice was sufficient. By it, White Fang knew whether he did right or not. By it, he trimmed his conduct and adjusted his actions. It was the compass by which he steered and learned to chart the manners of a new land and life. In the Northland, the only domesticated animal was the dog. All other animals lived in the wild and were, when not too formidable, lawful spoil for any dog. All his days White Fang had foraged among the live things for food. It did not enter his head that in the Southland it was otherwise. But this he was to learn early in his residence in Santa Clara Valley. Sauntering around the corner of the house in the early morning, he came upon a chicken that had escaped from the chicken yard. White Fang's natural impulse was to eat it. A couple of bounds, a flash of teeth, and a frightened squawk, and he had scooped in the adventurous fowl. It was farm-bred, and fat and tender, and White Fang licked his chops and decided that such fare was good. Uh-oh, he's learned a thing. He's learned that chicken is good. He's becoming human. Later in the day, he chanced upon another stray chicken near the stables. One of the grooms ran to the rescue. He did not know White Fang's breed, so for weapon he took a light buggy whip. At the first cut of the whip, White Fang left the chicken for the man. A club might have stopped White Fang, but not a whip. Silently, without flinching, he took a second cut in his forward rush, and as he leapt for the throat, the groom cried out, "My God!" and staggered backward. He dropped the whip and shielded his throat with his arms. In consequence, his forearm was ripped open to the bone. The man was badly frightened. It was not so much White Fang's ferocity as it was his silence that unnerved the groom. Still protecting his throat and face with his torn and bleeding arm, he tried to retreat to the barn. And it would have gone hard with him had not Collie appeared on the scene. As she had saved Dick's life, she now saved the groom's. She rushed upon White Fang in frenzied wrath. She had been right. She had known better than the blundering gods. All her suspicions were justified. Here was the ancient marauder up to his old tricks again. The groom escaped into the stables, and White Fang backed away before Collie's wicked teeth, or presented his shoulder to them and circled round and round, but Collie did not give over. As was her wont, after a decent interval of chastisement, on the contrary, she grew more excited and angry every moment until, in the end, White Fang flung dignity to the winds and frankly fled away from her across the fields. "He'll learn to leave chickens alone," the master said, "but I can't give him the lesson until I catch him in the act." What about the servants? How about the servants? You leave the servants alone too, maybe? 2 nights later came the act. Well, you know. Yeah, I know. Dear, oh dear. 2 nights later came the act, but on a more generous scale than the master had anticipated. White Fang had observed closely the chicken yards and the habits of the chickens. In the night time, after they had gone to roost, he climbed to the top of a pile of newly hauled lumber. From there he gained the roof of a chicken house. passed over the ridgepole, and dropped to the ground inside. A moment later, he was inside the house, and the slaughter began. He's a fox. We now have a fox, ladies and gentlemen. In the morning, when the master came out onto the porch, 50 white leghorn hens laid out in a row by the groom greeted his eyes. He whistled to himself softly, first with surprise and then, at the end, with admiration. His eyes were likewise greeted by White Fang, but about the latter there were no signs of shame or guilt. He carried himself with pride, as though, forsooth, he had achieved a deed praiseworthy and meritorious. There was about him no consciousness of sin. The master's lips tightened as he faced the disagreeable task, and he talked harshly to the unwitting culprit, and in his voice there was nothing but godlike wrath. Also, he held White Fang's nose down to the slain hens and at the same time cuffed him soundly. I hunted and I share. Yeah, I know, poor doggo. Doggo's just doing what doggo does. White Fang never raided a chicken roost again. It was against the law, and he had learned it. And the master took him into the chicken yards. White Fang's natural impulse when he saw the live food fluttering about him and under his very nose was to spring upon it. He obeyed the impulse and was checked by the master's voice. They continued in the yards for half an hour. Time and again the impulse surged over White Fang, and each time as he yielded to it, he was checked by the master's voice. Thus it was he learned the law, and ere he left the domain of the chickens, he had learned to ignore their existence. I don't know, man. I think we should all be able to eat chickens. You can never cure a chicken killer. Judge Scott shook his head sadly at luncheon table when his son narrated the lesson he had given White Fang. Once they've got the habit and the taste of blood. Again, he shook his head sadly. But Weedon Scott did not agree with his father. I'll tell you what I'll do, he challenged finally. I'll lock White Fang in with the chickens all afternoon. But think of the chickens, objected the judge. And furthermore, the son went on, for every chicken he kills, I'll pay you $1 gold coin of the realm. But you should penalize father too, interposed Beth. Her sister seconded her, and a chorus of approval arose from around the table. Judge Scott nodded his head in agreement. All right, Weedon Scott pondered for a moment. And if, at the end of the afternoon, White Fang hasn't harmed a chicken, for every 10 minutes of the time he has spent in the yard, you will have to say to him, gravely and with deliberation, just as if you were sitting on the bench and solemnly passing judgment, White Fang, you are smarter than I thought. From hidden points of vantage, the family watched the performance, but it was a fizzle. Locked in the yard and there deserted by the master, White Fang lay down and went to sleep. Once he got up and walked over to the trough for a drink of water. The chickens he calmly ignored. So far as he was concerned, they did not exist. At 4 o'clock, he executed a running jump, gained the roof of the chicken house, and leaped to the ground outside, whence he sauntered gravely to the house. He had learned the law. And on the porch, before the delighted family, Judge Scott face to face with White Fang, and slowly and solemnly, 16 times, White Fang, you are smarter than I thought. But it was the multiplicity of laws that befuddled White Fang, and often brought him into disgrace. He had to learn that he must not touch the chickens that belonged to other gods. Then there were cats and rabbits and turkeys. All these he must let alone. In fact, when he had but partly learned the law, his impression was that he must leave all live things alone. Out in the back pasture, a quail could flutter up under his nose unharmed. All tense and trembling with eagerness and desire, he mastered his instinct and stood still. He was obeying the will of the gods. And we are going to obey the will of Twitch and run some ads. Yeah, exactly, just like kittens. But what about this one? What about this one? Can I jump up on this side of the table? Okay, but what about this side of the table? What if I What if I try to eat your food from the front of the plate? No, how about the side of the plate? This is what we went through with Gwen and maybe mostly Gwen. But yeah, it's just them asking, hey, okay, it's clearly not okay that I eat your food from the plate on this side. But I don't know if I'm allowed to eat it from the other side. It's an honest query. I think a lot of people think that cats are just being, or animals are just being insistent and pesky and just a pain in the butt. But no, they're the situations they learn are very specific. You just have to be patient and say, nope, that's mine. Nope, that's mine. Nope, that's still mine. And eventually they figure it out. It's how we got them to stop chewing on cables. Simply put your hand down, say, hey, nope, that cable's mine. You can't have it. And then, okay, fine. Then they tried to bite a different part of the cable, and you go, nope, that part's mine too. And eventually they just stopped. They still try to chew Velcro occasionally, but that's another matter. All right, off to the ads we go. We'll see you shortly. Okay, we have returned from the advertisements. Where were we? Right. He isn't eating even the quail now. He's obeying the will of the gods. And then one day, again out in the back pasture, he saw Dick start a jackrabbit and run it. The master himself was looking on and did not interfere. Nay, he encouraged White Fang to join in the chase, and thus he learned that there was no taboo on jackrabbits. In the end, he worked out the complete law. Between him and all domestic animals, there must be no hostilities. If not amity, then at least neutrality must obtain. But the other animals, the squirrels and quail and cottontails, were creatures of the wild who had never yielded allegiance to man. They were the lawful prey of any dog. It was only the tame that the gods protected, and between the tame deadly strife was not permitted. The gods held the power of life and death over their subjects, and the gods were jealous of their power. Life was complex in the Santa Clara Valley, after the simplicities of the Northland. And the chief thing demanded by these intricacies of civilization was control, restraint, a poise of self that was delicate as the fluttering gossamer wings and at the same time as rigid as steel. Life had 1,000 faces, and White Fang found he must meet them all. Thus, when he went to town, into San Jose, running behind the carriage or loafing about the streets when the carriage stopped, life flowed past him, deep and wide and varied, continually impinging upon his senses, demanding of him instant and endless adjustments and correspondences, and compelling him almost always to suppress his natural impulses. There were butcher shops where meat hung within reach. This meat he must not touch. There were cats at the houses the master visited that must be let alone. And there were dogs everywhere that snarled at him that he must not attack. And then, on the crowded sidewalks, there were persons innumerable whose attention he attracted. They would stop and look at him, point him out to one another, examine him, talk of him, and worst of all, pat him. Worst of all, yeah. And these perilous contacts from all these strange hands he must endure. Yet this endurance he achieved. Furthermore, he got over being awkward and self-conscious. In a lofty way, he received the attention of the multitudes of strange gods. With condescension, he accepted their condescension. On the other hand, there was something about him that prevented great familiarity. They patted him on the head and passed on, contented and pleased with their own daring. But it was not easy for White Fang. Running behind the carriage in the outskirts of San Jose, he encountered certain small boys who made a practice of flinging stones at him. Yet he knew that it was not permitted him to pursue and drag them down. Here, he was compelled to violate his instinct of self-preservation, and violate it he did, for he was becoming tame and qualifying himself for civilization. He was getting a certificate. Nevertheless, White Fang was not quite satisfied with the arrangement. He had no abstract ideas about justice and fair play, but there was a certain sense of equity that resides in life, and it was this sense in him that resented the unfairness of his being permitted no defense against the stone throwers. He forgot that in the covenant entered into between him and the gods, they were pledged to care for him and defend him. But one day the master sprang from the carriage, whip in hand, and gave the stone throwers a thrashing. After that, they threw stones no more, and White Fang understood and was satisfied. One other experience of similar nature was his. On the way to town, hanging around the saloon at the crossroads, were 3 dogs that made a practice of rushing out upon him when they went by. Knowing his deadly method of fighting, the master had never ceased impressing upon White Fang the law that he must not fight. As a result, having learned the lesson well, White Fang was hard put whenever he passed the crossroads saloon. After the first rush, each time, his snarl kept the 3 dogs at a distance, but they trailed along behind, yelping and bickering and insulting him. This endured for some time. The men at the saloon even urged the dogs on to attack White Fang. Animals. One day they openly sicked the dogs on him. The master stopped the carriage. "Go to it," he said to White Fang. But White Fang could not believe. He looked at the master, and he looked at the dogs, and he looked back eagerly and questioningly at the master. The master nodded his head. "Go to them, old fellow. Eat them up." I said that in possibly a far more kindly voice than Scott probably said it. "It'll be fine, don't worry. Have a meal. It's like takeout." White Fang no longer hesitated. He turned and leaped silently among his enemies. All 3 faced him. There was a great snarling and growling, a clashing of teeth, and a flurry of bodies. The dust of the road arose in a cloud and screened the battle, but at the end of several minutes 2 dogs were struggling in the dirt and the 3rd was in full flight. He leaped a ditch, went through a rail fence, and fled across a field. White Fang followed, sliding over the ground in wolf fashion and with wolf speed, swiftly and without noise, and in the center of the field he dragged down and slew the dog. With this triple killing, his main troubles with dogs ceased. The word went up and down the valley, and men saw to it that their dogs did not molest the fighting wolf. Chapter 4: The Call of Kind. The months came and went. There was plenty of food and no work in the Southland, and White Fang lived fat and prosperous and happy. Not alone was he in the geographical Southland, for he was in the Southland of life. Human kindness was like a sun shining upon him, and he flourished like a flower planted in good soil. And yet he remained somehow different from other dogs. He knew the law even better than did the dogs that had known no other life, and he observed the law more punctiliously. Okay, another word. But still there was about him a suggestion of lurking ferocity, as though the wild still lingered in him and the wolf in him merely slept. He never chummed with other dogs. Lonely he had lived, so far as his kind was concerned, and lonely he would continue to live. In his puppyhood, under the persecution of Lip Lip and the puppy pack, and in his fighting days with Beauty Smith, he had acquired a fixed aversion for dogs. The natural course of his life had been diverted, and recoiling from his kind, he had clung to the human. Besides, all Southland dogs looked upon him with suspicion. He aroused in them their instinctive fear of the wild, and they greeted him always with snarl and growl and belligerent hatred. He, on the other hand, learned that it was not necessary to use his teeth upon them. His naked fangs and writhing lips were uniformly efficacious, rarely failing to send a bellowing on rushing dog back on his haunches. But there was one trial in White Fang's life, Collie. She never gave him a moment's peace. She was not so amenable to the law as he. She defied all efforts of the master to make her become friends with White Fang. Ever in his ears was sounding her sharp, nervous snarl. She had never forgiven him the chicken-killing episode and persistently held to the belief that his intentions were bad. She found him guilty before the act and treated him accordingly. She became a pest to him, like a policeman following him around the stable and the hounds, and if he even so much as glanced curiously at a pigeon or chicken, bursting into an outcry of indignation and wrath. His favorite way of ignoring her was to lie down, with his head on his forepaws, and pretend sleep. This always dumbfounded and silenced her. It's good to have a good plan. With the exception of Collie, all things went well with White Fang. He had learned control and poise, and he knew the law. He achieved a staidness, a calmness, and philosophic tolerance. He no longer lived in a hostile environment. Danger and hurt and death did not lurk everywhere about him. In time, the unknown, as a thing of terror and menace ever impending, faded away. Life was soft and easy. It flowed along smoothly, and neither fear nor foe lurked by the way. He missed the snow without being aware of it. An unduly long summer would have been his thought had he thought about it. As it was, he merely missed the snow in a vague, subconscious way. In the same fashion, especially in the heat of summer when he suffered from the sun, he experienced faint longings for the Northland. Their only effect upon him, however, was to make him uneasy and restless, without his knowing what was the matter. What was the matter? White Fang had never been very demonstrative. Beyond his snuggling and the throwing of a crooning note into his love growl, he had no way of expressing his love. Yet it was given him to discover a third way. He had always been susceptible to the laughter of the gods. Laughter had affected him with madness, made him frantic with rage, but he did not have it in him to be angry with the Love Master. And when that god elected to laugh at him in a good-natured, bantering way, he was nonplussed. He could feel the prickling and stinging of the old anger as it strove to rise up in him, but it strove against love. He could not be angry, yet he had to do something. At first, he was dignified, and the master laughed the harder. Then he tried to be more dignified, and the master laughed harder than before. In the end, the master laughed him out of his dignity. His jaws slightly parted, his lips lifted a little, and a quizzical expression that was more love than humor came into his eyes. He had learned to laugh. Likewise, he learned to romp with the master, and to be tumbled down and rolled over, and be the victim of innumerable rough tricks. In return, he feigned anger, bristling and growling ferociously, and clipping his teeth together in snaps that had all the seeming of deadly intention. But he never forgot himself. Those snaps were always delivered on the empty air. At the end of such a romp, when blow and cuff and snap and snarl were fast and furious, they would break off suddenly and stand several feet apart, glaring at each other. And then, just as suddenly, like the sun rising on a stormy sea, they would begin to laugh. This would always culminate with the master's arms going around White Fang's neck and shoulders, while the latter crooned and growled his love song. But nobody else ever romped with White Fang. He did not permit it. He stood on his dignity, and when they attempted it, his warning snarl and bristling mane were anything but playful. That he allowed the master these liberties was no reason that he should be a common dog, loving here and loving there, everybody's property for a romp and good time. He loved with single heart, and refused to cheapen himself or his love. The master went out on horseback a great deal, and to accompany him was one of White Fang's chief duties in life. In the Northland he had evidenced his fealty by toiling in the harness, but here there were no sleds in the Southland, nor did dogs pack burdens on their backs. So he rendered fealty in the new way, by running with the master's horse. The longest day never played White Fang out. His was the gait of the wolf, smooth, tireless, and effortless. Indeed, he ran 3 days once. And at the end of 50 miles he would come in jauntily ahead of the horse. It was in connection with the riding that White Fang achieved one other mode of expression, remarkable in that he did it but twice in all his life. The first time occurred when the master was trying to teach a spirited thoroughbred the method of opening and closing gates without the rider's dismounting. As lazy. Time and again and many times he rang the horse up to the gate in an effort to close it, and each time the horse became frightened and backed and plunged away. It grew more nervous and excited every moment. When it reared, the master put the spurs to it and made it drop its forelegs back to earth, whereupon it would begin kicking with its hind legs. White Fang watched the performance with increasing anxiety until he could contain himself no longer, when he sprang in front of the horse and barked savagely and warningly. Oh, he often tried to bark thereafter, and the master encouraged him. He succeeded only once, and then it was not in the master's presence. A scamper across the pasture, a jackrabbit rising suddenly under the horse's feet, a violent shear, a stumble, a fall to earth, and a broken leg for the master, was the cause of it. White Fang sprang in a rage at the throat of the offending horse, but it was checked by master's voice. "Home! Go home!" the master commanded when he had ascertained his injury. White Fang was disinclined to desert him. The master thought of writing a note, but searching his pockets vainly for pencil and paper, again he commanded White Fang to go home. The latter regarded him wistfully, started away, then returned and whined softly. The master talked to him gently but seriously, and he cocked his ears and listened with painful intentness. "That's all right, old fellow. You just run along home," ran the talk. "Go on home and tell them what's happened to me. Home with you, you wolf. Get along home." Wouldn't it be funny if you went to the Northland again? Just like, okay, fine, I'll go back to the snow. White Fang knew the meaning of home, and though he did not understand the remainder of the master's language, he knew it was his will that he should go home. He turned and trotted reluctantly away. Then he stopped, undecided, and looked back over his shoulder. "Go home," came the sharp command, and this time he obeyed. The family was on the porch, taking the cool of the afternoon when White Fang arrived. He came in among them, panting, covered with dust. "Whedon's back," Whedon's mother announced. The children welcomed White Fang with glad cries and ran to meet him. He avoided them and passed down the porch, but they cornered him against a rocking chair and the railing. He growled and tried to push by them. Their mother looked apprehensively in their direction. "I confess, he makes me nervous around the children," she said. "I have a dread that he will turn upon them unexpectedly some day." Growling savagely, White Fang sprang out of the corner, overturning the boy and the girl. The mother called them to her and comforted them, telling them not to bother White Fang. "Wolf is a wolf," commented Judge Scott. "There's no trusting one." "But he's not a wolf. He's not all wolf," interposed Beth, standing for her brother in his absence. "You have only Whedon's opinion for that," rejoined the judge. "He merely surmises that there is some strain of dog in White Fang. But as he will tell you himself, he knows nothing about it. As for his appearance—" He did not finish his sentence. White Fang stood before him, growling fiercely. "Go away. Lie down, sir," Judge Scott commanded. White Fang turned to the love master's wife. She screamed with fright as he seized her dress in his teeth and dragged on it till the frail fabric tore away. By this time he had become the center of interest. He had ceased from his growling and stood, head up, looking into their faces. His throat worked spasmodically, but he made no sound, while he struggled with all his body convulsed with the effort to rid himself of the incommunicable something that strained for utterance. "I hope he's not going mad," said Whedon's mother. "I told Whedon that I was afraid the warm climate would not agree with an Arctic animal." "He's trying to speak, I do believe," Beth announced. At this moment, speech came to White Fang. He rushed up in a great burst of barking. The next line, "Something has happened to Whedon." White Fang's real identity is Lassie, apparently. "Something has happened to Whedon," his wife said decisively. They were all on their feet now, and White Fang ran down the steps, looking back for them to follow. For the second and last time in his life, he had barked and made himself understood. Yeah, Timmy fell in the well, that's right. After this event, he found a warmer place in the hearts of the Sierra Vista people. And even the groom whose arm he had slashed admitted that he was a wise dog, even if he was a wolf. Judge Scott still held to the same opinion, and proved it to everyone's dissatisfaction by measurements and descriptions taken from the encyclopedia and various works on natural history. The days came and went, streaming their unbroken sunshine over the Santa Clara Valley, but as they grew shorter, and White Fang's second winter in the Southland came on, he made a strange discovery. Collie's teeth were no longer sharp. There was a playfulness about her nips and a gentleness that prevented them from really hurting him. He forgot that she had made life a burden to him, and when she disported herself around him, he responded solemnly, striving to be playful and becoming no more than ridiculous. One day she led him off on a long chase through the back pasture land into the woods. It was the afternoon that the master was to ride, and White Fang knew it. The horse stood saddled and waiting at the door. White Fang hesitated. But there was that in him deeper than all the law he had learned, than the customs that had molded him, than his love for the master, than the very will to live of himself. And when, in the moment of his indecision, Collie nipped him and scampered off, he turned and followed after. The master rode alone that day, and in the woods, side by side, White Fang ran with Collie, and his mother, Kichi, an old One-Eye, had run misspoke. And in the woods, side by side, White Fang ran with Collie, as his mother, Kichi, an old One-Eye, had run long years before, in the silent Northland forest. They're gonna go make babies. Yes, babies. Chapter 5. The Sleeping Wolf. It was about this time that the newspapers were full of the daring escape of a convict from Quentin prison. He was a ferocious man. He had been ill-made in the making. He had not been born right, and he had not been helped by the molding he had received at the hands of society. The hands of society are harsh, and this man was a striking sample of its handiwork. He was a beast, a human beast, it is true, but nevertheless so terrible a beast that he can best be characterized as carnivorous. That is unfair to carnivores, by the way. Quentin. In San Quentin, I'm just going to have to settle for that. I don't think that pronunciation's right. In San Quentin prison, he had proved incorrigible. Punishment failed to break his spirit. That is correct. It should be like Quentin, but it's Quentin, I guess. He could die dumb mad and fighting to the last, but he could not live and be beaten. The more fiercely he fought, the more harshly society handled him, and the only effect of harshness was to make him fiercer. Straight jackets, starvation, and beatings and clubbings were the wrong treatment for Jim Hall, but it was the treatment he received. It was the treatment he had received from the time he was a little pulpy boy in San Francisco slum, soft clay in the hands of society and ready to be formed into something. It was during Jim Hall's third term in prison that he encountered a guard that was almost as great a beast as he. The guard treated him unfairly, lied about him to the warden, lost his credits, persecuted him. The difference between them was that the guard carried a bunch of keys and a revolver. Jim Hall had only his naked hands and his teeth, but he sprang upon the guard one day and used his teeth on the other's throat, just like any jungle animal. After this, Jim Hall went to live in the incorrigible cell. He lived there 3 years. The cell was of iron, the floor, the walls, the roof. He never left his cell. He never saw the sky nor the sunshine. Day was a twilight and night was a black silence. He was in an iron tomb, buried alive. He saw no human face, spoke to no human thing. When his food was shoved into him, he growled like a wild animal. He hated all things. For days and nights he bellowed his rage at the universe. For weeks and months he never made a sound. In the black silence, eating his very soul, he was a man and a monstrosity, as fearful a thing of fear as ever gibbered in the visions of a maddened brain. Well, yes, you'd literally go mad going through that. And then, one night, he escaped. The warders said it was impossible, but nevertheless the cell was empty, and half in, half out of it lay the body of a dead guard. 2 other dead guards marked his trail through the prison to the outer walls, and he had killed with his hands to avoid noise. He was armed with the weapons of the slain guards, a live arsenal that fled through the hills, pursued by the organized might of society. A heavy price of gold was upon his head. Avaricious farmers hunted him with shotguns. His blood might pay off a mortgage or send a son to college. Public-spirited citizens took down their rifles and went out after him. A pack of bloodhounds followed the way of his bleeding feet. And the sleuth hounds of the law, the paid fighting animals of society, with telephone and telegraph and special train, clung to his trail night and day. Sometimes they came upon him, and men faced him like heroes, or stampeded through barbed wire fences to the delight of the Commonwealth, reading the account at the breakfast table. It was after such encounters that the dead and the wounded were carted back to the towns, and their places filled by men eager for the manhunt. And then Jim Hall disappeared. The bloodhounds vainly quested on the lost trail. Inoffensive ranchers in remote valleys were held up in armed men and compelled to identify themselves, while the remains of Jim Hall were discovered on a dozen mountainsides by greedy claimants for blood money. In the meantime, the newspapers were read at Sierra Vista, not so much with interest as with anxiety. The women were afraid. Judge Scott pooh-poohed and laughed, but not with reason. For it was in his last days on the bench that Jim Hall had stood before him and received sentence. And in open courtroom before all men, Jim Hall had proclaimed that the day would come when he would wreak vengeance on the judge that sentenced him. For once, Jim Hall was right. He was innocent of the crime for which he was sentenced. It was a case, in the parlance of thieves and police, of railroading. Jim Hall was being railroaded to prison for a crime he had not committed. Because of the 2 prior convictions against him, Judge Scott imposed upon him a sentence of 50 years. Judge Scott did not know all things, and he did not know that he was party to a police conspiracy, that the evidence was hatched and perjured, that Jim Hall was guiltless of the crime charged. And Jim Hall, on the other hand, did not know that Judge Scott was merely ignorant. Jim Hall believed that the judge knew all about it and was hand in glove with the police in the perpetration of the monstrous injustice. Perpetration. So it was, when the doom of 50 years of living death was uttered by Judge Scott, that Jim Hall, hating all things in the society that misused him, rose up and raged in the courtroom until dragged down by 6 of his blue-coated enemies. To him, Judge Scott was the keystone in the arch of injustice. And upon Judge Scott he emptied the vials of his wrath and hurled the threats of his revenge yet to come. Then Jim Hall went to his living death and escaped. Of all this White Fang knew nothing, but between him and Alice, the master's wife, there existed a secret. Each night after Sierra Vista had gone to bed, she rose and let in White Fang to sleep in the big hall. Now White Fang was not a house dog, nor was he permitted to sleep in the house, so each morning, early, she slipped down and let him out before the family was awake. On one such night, while all the house slept, White Fang awoke and lay very quietly. And very quietly he smelled the air and read the message it bore of a strange god's presence. And to his ears came sounds of the strange god's movements. White Fang burst into no furious outcry. It was not his way. The strange god walked softly, but more softly walked White Fang, for he had no clothes to rub against the flesh of his body. He followed silently. In the wild he had hunted live meat that was infinitely timid, and he knew the advantage of surprise. The strange god paused at the foot of the great staircase and listened, and White Fang was as dead. So without movement was he as he watched and waited. Up that staircase the way led to the Love Master and to the Love Master's dearest possessions. White Fang bristled but waited. The strange god's foot lifted. He was beginning the ascent. Then it was that White Fang struck. He gave no warning. With no snarl anticipated his own action. Into the air he lifted his body in the spring that landed him on the strange god's back. White Fang clung with his forepaws to the man's shoulders, at the same time burying his fangs into the back of the man's neck. He clung on for a moment, long enough to drag the god over backward. Together they crashed to the floor. White Fang leaped clear and, as the man struggled to rise, was in again with the slashing fangs. Sierra Vista awoke in alarm. The noise from downstairs was as that of a score of battling fiends. There were revolver shots. A man's voice screamed once in horror and anguish. There was a great snarling and growling, and over all arose a smashing and crashing of furniture and glass. But almost as quickly as it had arisen, the commotion died away. The struggle had not lasted more than 3 minutes. The frightened household clustered at the top of the stairway. From below, as from out of an abyss of blackness, came up a gurgling sound, as of air bubbling through water. Sometimes this gurgle became sibilant, almost a whistle, but this too quickly died down and ceased. Then naught came up out of the blackness save a heavy panting of some creature struggling sorely for air. Weedon Scott pressed the button, and the staircase and downstairs hall were flooded with light. Then he and Judge Scott, revolvers in hand, cautiously descended. There was no need for this caution. White Fang had done his work. In the midst of the wreckage of overthrown and smashed furniture, partly on his side, his face hidden by an arm, lay a man. Weedon Scott bent over, removed the arm, and turned the man's face upward. A gaping throat explained the manner of his death. "Jim Hall," said Judge Scott, and father and son looked significantly at each other. And they turned to White Fang. He too was laying on his side. His eyes were closed, but the lids slightly lifted in an effort to look at them as they bent over him, and the tail was perceptibly agitated in a vain effort to wag. Weedon Scott patted him, and his throat rumbled an acknowledging growl, but it was a weak growl at best, and it quickly ceased. His eyelids drooped and went shut, and his whole body seemed to relax and flatten out upon the floor. "He's all in, poor devil," muttered the master. "We'll see about that," asserted the judge as he started for the telephone. "Frankly, he has 1 chance in 1,000, announced the surgeon after he had worked an hour and a half on White Fang. Dawn was breaking through the windows and dimming the electric lights. With the exception of the children, the whole family was gathered about the surgeon to hear his verdict. "1 broken hind leg," he went on, 3 broken ribs, one at least of which has pierced his lungs. He has lost nearly all the blood in his body. There is a large likelihood of internal injuries. He must have been jumped upon, to say nothing of 3 bullet holes clear through him. 1 chance in 1,000 is really optimistic. He hasn't a chance in 10,000. But he mustn't lose any chance that might be of help to him, Judge Scott exclaimed. Never mind expense. Put him under the X-ray, anything. Whedon, telegraph at once to San Francisco for Dr. Nichols. No reflection on you, Doctor, you understand, but he must have the advantage of every chance. The surgeon smiled indulgently. Of course, I understand. He deserves all that can be done for him. He must be nursed as you would nurse a human being, a sick child. And don't forget what I told you about temperature. I'll be back at 10 o'clock tonight. Or I'll be back at 10 o'clock again. White Fang received the nursing. Judge Scott's suggestion of a trained nurse was indignantly clambered down by the girls who themselves undertook the task, and White Fang won out on the 1 chance in 10,000 denied him by the surgeon. The latter was not to be censured for his misjudgment. All his life he attended and operated on the soft humans of civilization who lived sheltered lives and had descended out of many sheltered generations. Compared with White Fang, they were frail and flabby and clutched life without any strength in their grip. White Fang had come straight from the wild, where the weak perish early and shelter is vouchsafed to none. In neither his father nor his mother was there any weakness, nor in the generations before them. A constitution of iron and the vitality of the wild were White Fang's inheritance, and he clung to life. The whole of him and every part of him, in spirit and in flesh, with the tenacity that of old belonged to all creatures. Bound down a prisoner, denied even movement by the plaster casts and bandages, White Fang lingered out the weeks. He slept long hours and dreamed much, and through his mind passed an unending pageant of Northland visions. All the ghosts of the past arose and were with him. Once again he lived in the lair with Kichi, crept trembling to the knees a grey beaver to tender his allegiance, ran for his life before Lip Lip and all the howling bedlam of the puppy pack. The packy pup. He ran again through the silence, hunting his living food through the months of famine, and again he ran at the head of the team, the gut whips of Bitsa and Grey Beaver snapping behind, their voices crying, "Rah! Rah!" When they came to a narrow passage and the team closed together like a fan to go through, he lived again, all his days with Beauty Smith and the fights he had fought. At such times he whimpered and snarled in his sleep, and that they looked on and said that his dreams were bad. But there was one particular nightmare from which he suffered. The clanking, clanging monsters of electric cars that were to him colossal screaming lynxes. He would lie in a screen of bushes, watching for a squirrel to venture far enough out on the ground from its tree refuge. Then, when he sprang out upon it, it would transform itself into an electric car, menacing and terrible, towering over him like a mountain, screaming and clanging and spitting fire at him. It was the same when he challenged the hawk down out of the sky. Down out of the blue at her rush, as it dropped upon him, changing itself into the ubiquitous electric car. Or again, he would be in the pen of Beauty Smith. Outside the pen, men would be gathering, and he knew that a fight was on. He watched the door for his antagonist to enter. The door would open, and thrust in upon him would come the awful electric car. 1,000 times this occurred, and each time the terror it inspired was as vivid and great as ever. Then came the day when the last bandage and the last plaster cast were taken off. It was a gala day. All Sierra Vista was gathered around. The master rubbed his ears, and he crooned his love growl. The master's wife called him the Blessed Wolf. which name was taken up with acclaim, and all the women called him the Blessed Wolf. He tried to rise to his feet, and after several attempts fell down from weakness. He had lain so long that his muscles had lost their cunning, and all the strength had gone out of them. He felt a little shame because of his weakness, as though, forsooth, he were failing the gods in the service he owed them. And that was Gwen again. What do you want? Yeah?
Here to cause trouble?
In the service he owed him. Because of this, he made heroic efforts to arise, and at the last he stood on his 4 legs, tottering and swaying back and forth. The Blessed Wolf, chorused the women. Yes, Gwen is meowing. Now she's doing silent meows whenever I look at her. I think she wants up on the floating shelf where the hats are. Judge Scott surveyed them triumphantly. Out of your own mouths be it, he said. Just as I contended right along, no mere dog could have done what he did. He's a wolf. A blessed wolf, amended the judge's wife. Yes, a blessed wolf, agreed the judge, and henceforth that shall be my name for him. He'll have to learn to walk again, said the surgeon, so he might as well start in right now. It won't hurt him. Take him outside. And outside he went, like a king with all Sierra Vista about him and tending on him. He was very weak, and when he reached the lawn he lay down and rested for a while. Then the procession started on. Little spurts of strength coming into White Fang's muscles as he used them, and the blood began to surge through them. The stables were reached, and there in the doorway lay Collie, a half-dozen pudgy puppies playing about her in the sun. White Fang looked on with a wondering eye. Collie snarled warningly at him, and he was careful to keep his distance. The master with his toe helped one sprawling puppy toward him. He bristled suspiciously, but the master warned him that all was well. Warned him? Maybe assured him? Collie, clasped in the arms of one of the women, watched him jealously, and with a snarl warned him that all was not well. The puppy sprawled in front of him. He cocked his ears and watched it curiously, and their noses touched, and he felt the warm little tongue of the puppy on his jowl. White Fang's tongue went out. He knew not why, and he licked the puppy's face. Oh, this tastes like my puppy. Hand-clapping and pleasing cries from the gods greeted the performance. He was surprised and looked at them in a puzzled way. And his weakness asserted itself, and he lay down, his ears cocked, his head to one side as he watched the puppy. The other puppies came sprawling toward him, to Collie's great disgust, and he gravely permitted them to clamber and tumble over him. At first, amid the applause of the gods, he betrayed a trifle of his old self-consciousness and awkwardness. This passed away as the puppy's antics and mauling continued, and he lay with half-shut, patient eyes, drowsing in the sun. The end. So, we won't be reading this next week. Yeah. I was a little worried that we would be ending on a note of a little darker. Yeah, but also, yay for finishing. It's nice to finish the book. We are going to call it there because it's close enough to out my 10 p.m. Schedule, I guess. But my usual schedule. So we won't start Camilla. We'll start Camilla next week. But I was a little worried that we were going to end with the end of the life of White Fang, right? Yeah, the dog does not die. Well, like eventually he'll die. He is a living organism, to be fair. But hey, his legacy will continue. Until then, he's going to interact with his offspring in a way that his father wasn't permitted to interact with him through like the natural order of things. Not in the book, no. Maybe the sequel? Is there a sequel? Chapter 1. He grew old and passed away peacefully with lots of chicken. Many chickens. Yes. Oh, that was very nice, though. Let's see. Who do we got? We're going to raid out. Yeah, it was a good book. I was a little choked up in a few places, to be perfectly honest. I was wondering if the book got more... If some of the scenes went a little further than they did. Yeah, I don't know. So far to date, I haven't cried whilst reading. But I wouldn't put it past me. Yes. I would not put it past me. Do we have... We don't. Okay. All right. Let's see. Is... No, I don't think so. Okay. We're going to hit Rar up, I think. Yeah. He is playing. Well, I think everyone here is already watching him, but I'm going to take the credit. Steal the credit. He is playing Mouse PI for hire. It's a cute game.